I know. I do have these highlighted. Or at least so. You see that?
Okay. Good
Recording
evening,
in
everyone.
progress.
Calling to order the April 3rd meeting of the Newton School Committee. Hello to everyone in the school committee chamber. Lots of familiar faces, and hello to everyone joining us from home. At the top of tonight's meeting, I do want to express tremendous gratitude for the several hundreds of parents and guardians, students, teachers, and residents who packed the standing room only cafeteria at Newton North last Tuesday for an important conversation in our community about the things that we value and the things that we as a community hope to see improved. I heard strong support for our NPS diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and I heard strong support for an engaged and motivated parent and student body. So I think we have a lot of things to work on, and we are very motivated to work on those items together as a community. So tonight we do not have public comment. I know there was a bit of confusion with our notice because of a discrepancy with the title of tonight's meeting, a special school committee meeting with no public comment, and then the body of the meeting, which acknowledged a bit of public comment as a holdover provision from a previous meeting. We've since corrected that posting, and as I said, there won't be public comment tonight, but there will be a public hearing on April 12th, and there will also be public comment during our April 12th school committee regular meeting. So with that, we're going to turn to our interim superintendent update and begin with that.
Thank you, Tamika. I want to start by bringing to everyone's attention something that was sent to me. And a fellow passed away, Ernest Van Seeholz, who probably is a name that many of you recognize, passed away this past March of 2023. But reading his obituary and looking at his accomplishments, especially those in the Newton Public Schools, I thought was worthy of speaking about. So he became a principal at the Day Junior High, and that dates me because before middle schools, I did work at a junior high. So in 1967, he became principal there. In 1973, he became principal of Newton South High School for 25 years, finally retiring in 1998. This struck me as something that they included in his obituary, and he was certainly ahead of his time. And it says, Van believed that everyone deserved to be celebrated for who they are, regardless of race, nationality, gender, or religion. He took great pride in his collaboration with the METCO program and was an advocate for educational access for all. I'm told he took the time to, and I don't know how you do this at a high school, to meet the ninth graders one by one to make sure that he knew them going through the schools. So I would just like to ask everybody to celebrate his life here in the Newton Public Schools and to keep his family in your thoughts. And next, on Friday, the 31st, we actually completed our PTO school visits to every one of our elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools. We ended up with Bowen being our final school visit. Certainly that was a different conversation, as you can imagine, and tonight we will start to get into deep discussions, but it was about the budget. It was about the impact, and parents have concerns. And I've received so many letters from so many of you. I am trying to at least acknowledge that I have received it. Believe me, I copy them. I love paper. I make copies of every single one of them. I look at them, I read them, and I really try to make sense of everything that we're trying to do right now. So please understand that we are with you. We're going to continue to have our discussions, and I assure you we're doing the very best that we can for our students and our schools. But I want to also say on those visits, and you've heard me talk about this, they were some of the most impactful, important things that I have done as an interim superintendent. And truly, I want to thank my own team that joined me on these visits. I want to thank the school committee members, our mayor that were present at so many of these, answering questions and letting people know your role, that you're here. I watch you also answer, hundreds of emails and deeply get into conversations, with our parents and our community members. And thank you, principals. We have a number of principals here with us this evening. You were by our side hosting these events along with your PTO teams and the many community members that we have met, I want to say going back to last November. So thank you again. I'm actually looking forward to getting out in the schools and to celebrate all that is wonderful about the Newton Public Schools. And please invite me to your events. I'm looking forward to really being able to see our students in action. And I also want to thank Mayor Fuller, school committee members, central staff, principals, district leaders, NTA leadership for taking time out of your very busy schedules to attend the superintendent FY24 budget presentation very early last Wednesday morning. The presentation detailed the increases in funding from the city, the very real budget drivers that are impacting this budget, and the collaborative efforts to contend with a $4.9 million shortfall to try to deliver a balanced budget to our school committee. As I stated, we will start the process this evening. We're going to be having deep discussions for, I would say, 3 nights with presentations and discussions, beyond that. And finally, I want to finish by saying, when you put together a budget presentation, and especially as an interim superintendent, it was my opportunity to try to thank all of you that have certainly stood by my side, that have shared your wisdom, your knowledge of the district, and have really been through this journey with me. And as I put together name by name, you know what happens when you do that. There's always some name that you have left out. So I have to share that I don't know how I left An Ping's name out when I listed school committee. So please allow me, I went back, I don't usually like to go back and look at the presentations, but something struck me. I went back and I said, I cannot believe it. So An Ping, he deserves special recognition for convincing me that the way to end my long career would be to serve as the interim superintendent for the Newton Public Schools. An Ping is a proud member of this prestigious committee and never let on to me that the challenges would be great, that the meetings would be marathons, the community greatly engaged, and the rewards were many as I get to laugh with him when the work is completed. So An Ping, thank you for bringing me to Newton. Makes me feel better.
Thank you, Kathy. We enjoyed that bit of levity, and I'm sure An Ping did as well. We're going to move on now to our consent agenda. There are a few items.
To ask questions.
Oh, sure. I'm sorry, Co.
Yeah, I had a question. I know we're moving on to the budget phase, but I know that at the hearing on last Tuesday, there was a statement made about the AP scores. And I just would like to request that before the end of the year that we examine that statement that there's a decline in our AP scores. Is that something that we can do?
So Cove, you know that as soon as I got back here, I brought in Dr. Hoag, who already was on it. There's really a whole story to tell versus, a data spot that is on the DESE website. We're really proud of a lot of our work with increasing accessibility to AP classes, but it even goes beyond that. So we are putting together information right now. I know that Dr. Hoag is going to be with us, I believe, the 24th of April. She's going to be doing a presentation, and I asked her at that meeting if she would add and really share with us some information about our scores in the district with both North and South High School.
Thanks, that's perfect.
Okay.
Good. Another one? Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you, Tamika. So I have a comment directly related to the budgetary items that Kathy was just mentioning. And I guess I'll just briefly start by saying, look, I think this is we're contemplating a level of cuts to our services that none of us find acceptable. And I think before we hear from the central staff, I'd like to propose that we somewhat reframe this discussion. And I'm prepared tonight to propose that we reduce the line items of the 3% OPEB contribution, the Medicare Part B premiums that we reimburse, and the renewable energy credits for which we write a check to the city. and that we reallocate these funds to restore our budget priorities that we laid out last December. And if you'll give me a moment, I can speak about this in a little more detail.
How about we table those comments till after the presentation? Because they will be equally as apt then as they are now. And that at that point, we might be able to have more just nuance and context around what is in front of us. So I'm just going to ask you to hold, not make your comments and your observations, but to hold them until after the presentation. I feel like they would be much better received and for us to contemplate them at that point, once we've actually heard what's in front of us.
Okay,
Okay, so
may I respond?
yes, you may. Yes.
I will grant you that. I do think this would be a more fruitful discussion to have up front, as opposed to hearing recommendations that may be based on a situation that doesn't come to pass.
Duly noted. Thank you very much, and thank you for holding the rest of your comments till after the presenters have had a chance to give us their just their overview of the recommendations before them or before us. Okay, so we're going to move on, barring no further questions regarding the interim update. Good. All right, we have 3 items in the consent agenda for tonight. We have approval of the October 21st, 2022 minutes, approval of the one-day liquor license for Cabot and Zervis, both for Spring Flings and Silent Auctions, Go Those Communities, and approval of out-of-state field trips for student competitions in Orlando and Springfield, Massachusetts. Does anyone wish to remove an item from the consent agenda? Hearing none, seeing none. Is there a motion to approve the items in the consent agenda?
Sorry, Paul.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Maybe in the reverse order, what we've been in the past. I'm happy to move that we approve the consent agenda.
Thank you, Emily and Paul.
Second.
Thank you for that second. We'll do a roll call vote. Ward 1,
Yes.
Ward 2,
Yes.
Ward 3,
Yes.
Ward 4, yes, Ward 5,
Yes.
Ward 6,
Yes.
Ward 7, yes, Ward 8,
Yes.
and Mayor Fuller.
Yes.
Right, all items in the consent agenda pass unanimously. At this point, we will dive right into our updates and discussion and begin our work this month with the FY24 budget presentations for elementary and secondary.
Thank you, Tamika. I'm going to begin the presentation and then we'll be joined by my 2 assistant superintendents for elementary and secondary education. And before I begin, you heard me mention earlier that we do have in the audience a number of our school leaders, and I certainly think worthy to mention who's here. And you know what, guys, if I miss anybody, please holler out. So I have Tammy Strauss here, our principal from Newton South High School. I have Jackie Mann, principal at Day Middle School. Henry Turner, principal at Newton North High School. Mark Chitty, Franklin Elementary School principal. Diana Beck, Zervis Elementary School. Becca Brogadier from Ward Elementary School. Beth Herlihy from Countryside Elementary School. And Kim Leistat from Brown Middle School. Is that everybody? Okay, well, thank you very much, principals. I know you have been, as we begin the presentation, you have been deeply involved. I know you're representing your colleagues this evening. If there are questions, we have the sources here after we do that presentation when we do talk about impact. So let me begin. The first slide, please. So I'm going to review not only the agenda for this evening, but you will see some slides that you have seen in similar presentations, actually going back to last Wednesday, but I think it is important to really set the stage for some of those important slides. So tonight we're going to review again our FY24 budget goal. We're going to look at those budget drivers and budget highlights that are clearly impacting this budget. We'll have a presentation from elementary education led by Aisha Farag, our assistant superintendent. And we will have secondary education, middle and high school, led by Assistant Superintendent Toby Roma. And we will continue to have an FY24 budget meeting timeline Again, just to let everybody know, this week, I believe on Thursday, the 6th, we will have student support services and we will have teaching and learning, very similar presentations. So I talked about this the other day, the budget goal in the beginning. You have seen this since back in January, on January 23rd, when we presented our so-called dueling budgets. Our goal at that time was to maintain the current level of services provided to students and build a sustainable budget over time. And what we talked about at that time was, again, coming off of the pandemic, looking at the supports we had put in place, both instructionally, also for mental health, social and emotional support, and getting back to our regular routines and the way that what has happened for our students for so many years in the Newton Public Schools looked like. We were unable to maintain the current level of services, and hence the discussions that we started to have last week with the opening and the presentation, and we'll continue to get into deep discussions in the next couple of weeks. But one thing that we are looking to do and making this a priority, and I keep saying this is not somewhere where we need to be again and again, we are looking to have a sustainable budget over time. So when it comes to this time of year, we are building our budget. We're looking at those budget drivers. We're also looking at where we've had impact in a positive way on learning, and are there other things that are not valued and will move on to something else. So we would like to be able to do that. That is what a budget process should look like. So again, we are going to look to build a sustainable budget. So looking at our budget drivers, and again, when we talk about the growing student needs, I've just talked about making sure that we had appropriate class sizes for our students, looking at coaching, interventionists. You've had presentations here talking about the support offered to those classroom teachers that were meaningful. Looking at the supports for SEL and mental health. We talked about being proud how when we started the school year and we watched other districts struggling to bring these additional people on board, you had already set those structures up in place, and we're looking to be able to provide those supports. So looking at rising costs and expenses, a couple that we talked about were special education transportation for vans, I believe up $500,000. Utilities up 25%, health insurance increases up 5%. We talked about the OSD rate, an increase from what we should have been expecting at about 3%, finding out that it was up about 14%, $1.4 million in additional funding that we have talked about, thank goodness, some support from the city, which we detailed at that budget presentation. Also looking at the amount of carry forward. So past years, it's been upward of, again, $4 million. We have a budget carry forward this year of just about $2 million. Looking at the one-time funding, and again, this isn't just for Newton. These are for all our neighboring districts. This is what we relied on to put a lot of those structures in place, looking at our technology coming out of the pandemic and making sure we were supporting this generation of students. And last but not least is the failed override. And I think it's important because I go back to so many discussions long ago. And when I look at where we are at this evening with a $4.9 million deficit, we were pretty right on with the $4.5 million needed in our operating override. I do understand the will of the voters. We have been working well before the actual vote on the 14th. But again, I just want people to look at that. It has been clearly impactful. This next slide is important. And again, when you talk about the budget allocation for FY23, and I want you to look down to the budget allocation in FY24. It is a 3.73% increase, almost a $10 million increase in funding from the city to support our schools. And we are thankful for that support for our students, for our budget. But when you go back and look at one-time carry forward funds from just a year ago, $4.5 million. Our available funding, $266 million budget for FY23. As I stated, we have presently with our allocation over $271 million, $2 million carry forward, a 1.4 million in what we're calling a circuit breaker bridge credit from the city. So you know that we have actively and continue to actively work with our state legislators. We are looking at their process as it goes through. But we right now at least have the support that that money, that additional money will be infused in our budget at this time. So $275 million, our funding that is available. And when I talk about, and if you go back to that first slide, maintaining services, we would need $280 million in this budget, which is almost a 7% increase. We understand, and I brought up when I talked about the 4.5 million, that would have been a 5.2% increase in our budget funding to be able to not only maintain, but we still would have had to look at minor decreases to build a sustainable budget. So our reductions necessary for building this balanced budget is just a little over $4.9 million. And what does the FY '24 budget support? And you will see this in each of the presentations. I know you saw it last Wednesday. I will not continue to review it, but again, I know there are people out there that are certainly watching this important budget process. So you will see and you will hear us talk about supporting a well-rounded curriculum with opportunities for academic support and advancement, our extracurricular programs, our counseling and therapeutic supports, our curriculum review, revisions, professional development for staff, and our coaching support, meaningful inclusive education with programming for students with disabilities, support to foster development of our social emotional skills and competencies, ongoing support for culturally responsive instruction and inclusion practices and protocols throughout the district, integration of technology into classroom instruction, including funding for one-to-one device program, reliable and secure network services and operations, and ongoing support for your building projects, maintenance, food services, and transportation programs. And I do believe when I spoke last Wednesday in introducing the budget, you will see reductions. You're going to hear about them this evening, but we did try to maintain the integrity of programs. So it wasn't slashing programs, it was reducing. We worked with, as I said, district leaders, principals, department heads, all to come up with the budget presentation that we will share with you this evening. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Aisha. And you are bringing your team.
They're
They're
gonna
coming.
join me, yeah. All right, let's see. Hi, everyone. I'm Aisha Farid, Assistant Superintendent for Elementary Education, and I'm grateful to be joined tonight by several principals, as Kathy introduced. We have here with me tonight Mark Chitty, Becca Brogadier, Diana Beck, and Beth Hurley. I always have this fear that I'm going to forget people's names when I'm in public introducing them. I've been working with them for how long? But I'm grateful to have them with me here tonight representing our team of elementary principals. I think it's really important as we get into questions that you're able to hear from school leaders about the impact of the budget decisions that we're making. And I know that other members of our team are watching via Zoom tonight and are always available to answer questions as well. Okay. On March 29th, Superintendent Smith shared our proposed budget, which included information about reductions in all cost centers, at which time you saw the major changes and impacts that are listed on the screen right now. Tonight, I'm going to review this information regarding the elementary education budget, including the major changes and anticipated impact, and provide insight into the thinking and the rationale that led us to these difficult decisions. Each year, as many of you know, the budget building process begins with an analysis of enrollment and projection of the number of classes that will be needed for the year ahead. According to our projections, we expect a decline of 31 students at the elementary level. And as you can see here, those are spread
across our 15 schools, with minimal changes expected at most. The column on the right shows you the schools that have more significant changes in their enrollment. These were explained by Katie Hogue in her January enrollment report. However, to recap, those schools with student decline, Franklin, Mason Rice, and Memorial Spalding, that is due primarily to a much larger graduating 5th grade class than incoming kindergarten class. In the case of Cabot and their increase, you've heard from Katie about this being the most rapidly growing school in the district. This due to high cohort survival rates within each of the grade levels, as well as several of the developments that are in that district, which account for the changes there. Despite minimal changes in enrollment at most schools, we are planning for the reduction of a total of 9 classrooms across the 15 schools in the year ahead. These changes that you see here represent a combination of enrollment-based reductions and budget-driven reductions, as I'll detail for you. I think this chart illustrates well how enrollment numbers, either increases or decreases, do not always equate to additions or reductions in staff in predictable ways. This is because new enrollments and withdrawals are spread across 6 grade levels and 15 schools. So you can see Ainger, with the difference of 1 student, is still going to be reducing by a classroom, and by comparison, 21 additional students expected at Cabot, and yet there's no change in their classrooms. It has everything to do with the way the enrollments and withdrawals fall. At the time of, at the time of the release of our annual enrollment report, we projected a reduction of 8 classrooms for this school year, and I spoke to you about that when I appeared before you earlier. After further analysis and consultation with principals and student services, we restored 4 positions to meet student and program needs, resulting in a net 4 FTE reduction. Following this, specialist teacher allocations, art, music, PE, and library, were determined based on the number of classrooms. And you'll see moving forward that I will reference art, music, and PE because they appear in the elementary education budget. Library teachers appear in a separate cost center. So looking here at enrollment or program-driven changes for the year ahead, we expect 4 classroom reductions based on enrollment. And then 4 add backs for a net decrease of 4 FTEs. So what I've detailed thus far are those changes that are expected based on enrollment, regardless of budget circumstances. However, in light of our budget shortfall, we need to identify additional cuts. And it's important to note that these are not cuts that we as educators recommend. It's not possible to make reductions of nearly $5 million without cutting positions. All of these positions are vital to our schools and programming and impact our students and their experience. These reductions have an impact on our ability to provide the kind of supportive and responsive school experience we want for all of our kids, especially in the face of increased needs. Before discussing these cuts, it feels important to provide an overview of the positions that exist in our elementary schools to help orient everyone to understand the team of educators that exist to work together to support our students. Schools don't look the same. When I think about positions, or at least what I was aware of when I was a student, I wasn't aware of very many of these positions. And so when I hear people talk, and in fact, we had some interesting conversations during public forums where someone would say, what is an interventionist? And we would have the opportunity to speak to the role of an interventionist, for example, and explain how they work together with classroom teachers, the role that's most well known, to support students in learning. So looking here, you see the constellation of positions that exist within an elementary school. Here you see the classroom teacher at the center. Everyone's familiar with the classroom teachers. And as we talked about in most years, the number of classroom teachers is driven by enrollment. Also included in the elementary education cost center are library, art, and music teachers, including allocations that are included for the music electives in grades 4 and 5. These instructional support positions fall under general education, literacy specialists, math coaches, intervention teachers, early intervention and early literacy and intervention assistants, and kindergarten aides all fall within the elementary education budget. A number of these pieces are, and then administration, principal, assistant principal, the administrative assistant. There are other positions that exist that fall under different cost center. Facilities, health services is actually the nurse is through the city. The mental health supports that we talk about so often fall under the student services budget. I'm sorry, I neglected to mention this one. Our substitute coverage, building aides, and lunch aides fall within the elementary education cost center. IT support is in a separate cost center. But some of these positions are caseload driven. So when you think about services for multi-language learners, those are caseload driven, and they fall under a different budget. When you think about special education and the myriad positions that exist there, those are all driven by caseload. So that's just a little bit of a orientation to understand what are the positions. So now we get to talking about the budget-driven reductions. The changes that follow represent proposed cuts for the purposes of addressing our budget shortfall in the year ahead. These are not reductions that are grounded in enrollment or educational or programmatic recommendations. I'll share the proposals and then discuss the anticipated impact of these cuts. So here you can see that we propose to reduce 5 additional classroom teachers in grades 3 through 5. This results in 12 classrooms in grades 3 through 5 that are projected to have 25 to 28 students. And you can see where those classrooms are here. Accompanying that, because the specialist allocations are aligned with the number of classrooms per school, this results in a 0.8 FTE reduction in specialist teachers. We also propose to reduce the number of kindergarten assistants in our classrooms. Currently, we have staff, when we developed the full-day kindergarten model, the model and intention was to have each classroom staffed with a full-time kindergarten aide. The proposal here is to reduce that staffing from 1 assistant to 1 assistant per 2 classes. Further reductions include reduction to half-time elementary assistant principal positions at Service and Memorial Spalding, which would leave 1 position remaining at the largest elementary school, which is Cabot Elementary. We propose to eliminate funding for the summer kindergarten program, Strong Start, and the Understanding Our Differences program. Strong Start is an incoming kindergarten readiness program, and Understanding Our Differences is a disability awareness program that currently offered in grades 2 through 5. We also propose to reduce music elective options for students in grades 4 and 5. This means that strings lessons and orchestra ensemble instruction will not be offered to elementary students next year. Our instrumental lessons and band instruction will continue, but this results in a 1.5 FTE music teacher reduction. I've gotten ahead of myself here with my notes. There were some additional budget adjustments that we needed to make within the elementary cost center. The first of which being felt it was necessary to add a specialist reserve back into the budget to allocate if necessary to address enrollment and our scheduling needs. With the extent of the reductions within the specialists, we reduce a great deal of flexibility needed for scheduling across 15 schools. And then we have a variety of partial FTEs, which really complicate scheduling. We also, the budget includes a 2.0 classroom teacher reserve in the event that enrollments necessitated the addition of an additional classroom. Therefore, having these additional FTEs here give us greater flexibility if ratios got to a point where we needed to add additional FTEs in light of an additional classroom being added. And finally, in terms of budget adjustments, this budget includes funding for the elementary planning time pilot, which as fulfills our responsibilities of the contract to convene the Elementary Labor Management Committee, which we started this work last year, to look at the issue of increasing elementary planning time, elementary teacher planning time. The resulting pilot will be conducted next year at Franklin, Memorial Spalding, and Williams schools, and expands music instruction in grades K-2 and adds 15 minutes of library instruction weekly for 3rd grade, which brings parity to planning time for teachers in grades K-2 with teachers in 3 to 5. So that work will be we'll launch that work next year. The committee will continue to meet, and that work will be ongoing to look at how that works. So the total, that brings us to a total elementary school reductions of 25.3 FTEs and $1,390,402. I wanted to give a little bit of insight into the thinking that went into the recommendations that we made here, the proposals that we're bringing to you. The school committee budget guidelines served as a place to start when we were putting together the budget for next year. Yet, as I had said before, the magnitude of the cuts made it necessary to think about other things. And we needed to be able to establish priorities in evaluating potential solutions to our budget circumstances. So I share this information to make it clear the thinking that was behind the proposals that we bring to you today. First of all, as you saw, there are a few areas from which to reduce in the elementary cost center. The purpose of showing you the diagram with the bubbles was to see what are the positions and what actually falls within the elementary cost center that we have to choose from when we're looking to make reductions. A second factor was thinking about identifying structural reductions substantive enough to yield necessary savings. We have all had the experience, myself included, of chipping away and trying to say we could take a little bit here and we could take a little bit here and take a little bit here, and it feels like you have not made a dent. We needed to identify things that brought enough money to make a dent. The nearly $5 million is a lot of money, and we needed to be able to identify those structural aspects of our budget that would yield ongoing savings. Looking at the budget guidelines that you provided, we felt committed to limiting the impact within any one of those budget guideline areas. As we looked at reductions in FTEs of positions in our schools, we felt committed to preserving the smallest class sizes for our youngest learners in grades K-2, as painful as it was to think about raising the class sizes in grades 3 through 5. And finally, we had lots of conversations that led us to this final priority, which was about the importance of maintaining a constellation of positions to help preserve systems of academic and social, emotional, and mental health supports that, in light of other challenges, would help to provide support for students and assistance for classroom teachers. This brings us back to our elementary staffing. You can now see here highlighted the areas impacted by our proposed cuts. Within nearly every of the areas, and nearly each of the areas within the elementary cost centers, we see these proposals have touched with the music electives, kindergarten aides, classroom teachers, assistant principals. The ELL aides are highlighted, however, they don't fall within this budget, but just in terms of understanding where the reductions are happening and what is maintained within elementary education. So now we turn to key impacts. We have favorable class size averages, particularly at grades K-2. The average for K-2 is 18.8, which is the same as it is this year. We saw the 3 through 5 increase slightly from 20 to 21.3. However, we are aware that there are 12 classrooms, as I mentioned, that are in that 25 to 28, we're projected to be in the 25 to 28 range. We know that these favorable class size averages help to provide the conditions that are beneficial for student learning, especially in light of the needs that we've discussed on numerous occasions here. We've maintained current levels of core instruction in art, music, and physical education classes. I will say add library to that too. This really ensures that all of our students are receiving a well-rounded curriculum. We know that these are important subjects for our students, and that our specialist teachers play an important role in our students' day and learning. We have preserved networks of intervention and support staffing to provide specialized expertise and additional help to address student needs and continue the work you've heard us talk about in our goals about our efforts to build effective tiered supports, being able to provide just-in-time support for students, being able to be responsive to students, whether they need additional enrichment, whether they need additional support, that we have the systems and structures in place to be able to meet those needs. And finally, for this slide, the restoration of per pupil allocation funding is really important. We had taken some reductions in per pupil allocation funding, and this is really responsive to increased costs of instructional supplies and resources that allow schools to purchase those supplies that they need. We turn now to some of the other impacts within this proposed budget, and the first of which is the higher class sizes in grades 3 through 5, impacting student attention and feedback to support a wide continuum of need. Certainly, we expect the challenges of communicating with more families is greater. The demands upon the teachers with higher class sizes are certainly need to be acknowledged, and the impact for our students. Fewer kindergarten aides will impact kindergarten programming and support with fewer small group instructional opportunities, and the need to really think about within schools how resources are used to support kindergarten classrooms effectively. And so thinking about how much further are the existing resources going to be spread. There are times, Diana Beck will tell you as a former kindergarten teacher, when you need help. If a student needs to leave the room, if a student needs additional support, and the school is going to be finding ways, whether the kindergarten assistant is available to do that or not, the school is going to have to rise to meet that child's needs. That stretches resources further, right? And it does limit the flexibility of the classroom teacher who works in partnership with that kindergarten assistant to think about the structure of lessons throughout the day, how students are grouped, what things can be going on, because there are two people supporting the young learners in that classroom. The elimination of the elementary strings program and orchestra really impacts our ability to support student musical interest and passion. And we know that this is going to have a domino effect on secondary music programs. I had the opportunity today to see a petition from students at the Ward School whose passion for their learning was evident. And within every one of these areas, right, knowing the impact that it has on our, certainly challenging to think about. Our specialist reductions, the resulting allocations and partial FTEs present challenges for scheduling, for flexibility, for staffing stability and staff retention. When we start to see the FTEs per staff members reduce further, we become concerned about losing high quality staff members to other districts who can provide full-time or greater time positions. The supplemental programming that I mentioned, the elimination of those programs, it provides less resources for us. These are programs that were aligned with our MPS goals, that resources that will no longer be available to us. And finally, the elimination of the assistant principal positions at the two schools I mentioned means reduced leadership support for students, for staff, and families on a day-to-day basis. That brings me to the end of this presentation. I suspect you all may have questions, and I'm glad to have the team here with me, as I mentioned, to help address those.
Thank you, Aisha. All right, let's dive right into questions from the members. Go ahead, Kathy.
So there's two areas where I've got questions. Maybe we can start with elementary strings. I'm wondering if you thought about whether there was a way to make similar kinds of reductions, but in a different way. Specifically, I'm thinking about Kathy's mantra of reduce instead of eliminate. And I'm wondering whether it would be possible to reduce the frequency of both string and band lessons and keep both. So instead of getting rid of strings and keeping band, could you make them both every other week programs instead of once a week programs? And I'm just wondering if that's something that you thought about, or whether that doesn't allow you to make the kinds of reductions you need to make.
Yeah, so we looked at, and one of the things I meant to share with you are with the myriad of other possibilities that we looked at, and thinking about what other things did we consider before arriving at this. And one of the things that we considered, we looked at a variety of different configurations. We looked at potentially delaying the program from 4th grade to 5th grade. We looked at a variety of different things. Ultimately, the discussion that I involved our fine arts coordinator, Richard King, in discussing these proposals. It's very difficult, as you can imagine, as a fine arts coordinator to recommend any cuts. However, where we landed was that the ease of implementation and the yielding the necessary savings would come from this change. It was also the last added. Going back some years now, the instrumental program has been longstanding. The orchestra program began in several schools and was grown over time to then exist in all schools. And so now it was looking back at a paring back of something that was the most recently added within that department.
And then, so I guess it sounds to me like what I'm hearing is you can't deliver a reasonable program if you're keeping both but reducing the amount of both band and orchestra lessons.
Simply the idea of reducing the frequency alone, I don't know that we ever discussed in terms of like how, but we'd have to look at what actual savings that would yield in terms of the staffing.
Mm-hmm. So I might ask you to think about that.
Okay.
And then the other area I wanted to have you talk about, and it may be that you're going to say this is a better conversation for Thursday, but the impacts of the understanding our differences proposal and how you will basically replace, or what your plans are for maintaining that curriculum in a different way.
I'm happy to speak briefly to that now. One of the things that and certainly principals can feel free to chime in, but one of the things I will say is that some of the work that's gone on every day in our schools to create inclusive environments for all students and to understand our differences happens daily. Currently, our SEL department has developed a variety of resources for educators that include resources around understanding neurodiversity and physical differences, and an assortment of books to accompany and support classroom teachers in addressing those topics in their classroom. That work is ongoing, as well as work to investigate curriculum resources that are useful and helpful in terms of addressing matters of disability in the classroom on an ongoing basis. That work continues. So that, I imagine that those conversations, I know that those conversations within our SEL department will continue. So that's what I would say about that right now.
Let me just add, and certainly when I talk about parents reaching out, many people in the community have reached out about this program that has certainly been in existence for, I believe, over 45 years, clearly valued. I sat with the mayor back a number of weeks ago with 3 members of the group. Again, talking about the impact. There was a mom there whose a son had a disability, and talked about how important it was to be able to share that with classmates and having our students understand. So I'm going to talk about this in a couple of ways. As Aisha said, this is the work that goes on every day in our district to talk about all of our differences. I had mentioned that certainly at this meeting. But here's the one thing that we also spoke about. We are looking at some of the units of study, some of the curriculum, the pedagogy. We do have some concerns. But again, we are willing to sit down, to have some discussions. I know, again, Dr. Nolan will be sitting in the seat and we'll have to move forward with this. Our team is stretched beyond belief, looking at some of the things as you hear even this evening, going forward. But we will commit to have a dialogue, an open dialogue, which we have been doing. But at this point here, when we were making decisions, it was a decision that we made not just on the budget deficit, but certainly impacted by the budget deficit, but other concerns about the delivery model, the strategy. I know there were some challenges, as there was for everybody during the pandemic. There were volunteers that were lost, and many of you were volunteers. I have heard, again, and having been a special education teacher, I value it, I understand it. Please give us the opportunity to do exactly what we're doing. Reviewing where we're at and looking at the possibility of some collaboration moving forward. But again, I want to thank everybody involved with the program. I know how valuable it has been for years, and it is a difficult decision. But as I said, it is not just a budget item. It is also an opportunity to review.
All set, Kathy?
Yes, thank you.
Go ahead, Emily.
So Kathy actually covered 2 subjects that I wanted to discuss. I just want to say 2 quick things about them before I move on to my other comments and questions. First is, you already acknowledged it, Aisha, and I appreciate that you did. I just can't stress enough what the impact is going to be on the strings program in the middle and the high school, and that there's going to be like a generation of kids who will not have that opportunity to move through. And I'm also afraid of what the fine arts cuts will end up being in the middle and high schools as a known consequence of making these cuts on strings. And by the way, I would like to thank every kiddo who did this and put this in our packet. I think it's very powerful and I really appreciate it. So thank you for doing that. That's one. In terms of understanding our differences, I understand and respect the fact that you're in dialogue to discuss, but there are 2 things about UOD that I just want to mention that have not been stated yet. The most important being that there are adults and former kids and even kids with these disabilities who come into the classroom and allow students to interact and talk kind of wackadoodle questions sometimes that their graders can come out with, but the volunteers that they have who come and volunteer their time to explain what it is to be a person and to talk to the students about being a person with that particular disability is incredibly powerful, especially in fostering that feelings of empathy, which is what we want people to identify with people who are different than we are and find the things that we have in common and also the ways that we're different and celebrate that. And that's one of the things I think is the main strength of that program. So I just wanted to put that out there. In terms of my questions, I have two questions. One is, what is the distribution of those 12 classrooms of the 25 to 28? Are we talking about a large number of 28, maybe only one or two? I'm not asking for specific schools. I'm just saying in general, like, is it evenly distributed? Where are the numbers falling now, which I know will and can change. So I recognize that.
Right, so I did in fact share which schools those are. You're asking about
The
what's the
numbers
actual
of the
number?
classrooms. Yeah.
So 28, 27. 28, 27. 26, 25. 26, 25. 27, 27, 26.
I am sorry.
Did anybody catch that?
Yeah, there you go.
You did, yeah.
So assuming it went down.
I can go down,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
can make that clear. I thought you were just interested in hearing the range of the numbers.
I'm just trying to understand like how many are on the 28 side and how many are on the 25 side. So like what the distribution is, that's all.
Needs 2 25s and then the rest 26.
Okay, so mostly 26 and 27. I am quite happy that we have those two reserve teachers, because I am sure, given the unexpected nature of move-ins, that we will probably be using them. So I appreciate that the reserve teachers are in the budget, and thank you for that. My other question has to do actually with something that, and I haven't asked this question, and it hasn't really come up. How frequently are we using interns? Like Leslie interns to come in and help? Because I just remember my kiddos who were in classes of 27 and 26 consistently from 24 in kindergarten on up. There was usually a Leslie, somebody for Leslie or from another one of the colleges and universities, and I'm wondering if we still do that and if that's a possible.
We tried to do
temporary.
that.
Okay.
Is the answer. The supply has dwindled tremendously.
Okay.
So we have seen a pretty dramatic reduction in the availability of interns. And I assume one of the reasons they're coming up because of the class size. In the event that interns would be available to be assigned, we would prioritize classes that are larger to have interns assigned to them to provide additional assistance. We'll have to see. We're going to start to head into intern season soon in terms of identifying folks who may be looking for placements for the year ahead. But I will say that in both the general education and special education, we've seen a reduced number of people seeking internships.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you, Tamika. Thank you, Kathy, and everybody who's worked on this budget. Having been through these kinds of cost pressures in other organizations, I know it's hard work. And I appreciate the efforts you've made to preserve things. First, can I just ask kind of a roadmap question? If, as Chris was suggesting before, there might be suggestions or motions from us with regard either to expense items or revenue items, will we handle those towards the end of the process? Is that what you would prefer?
I mean, typically we hear all of the impacts and we look at all of the proposals and the projected changes, and then we consider them as a block. You know, I think if there is a will to have that be a little bit more piecemeal, we can examine that, but then there's certainly going to be, that's going to allow you a very narrow view, a narrow piece, rather than looking at the whole. You all tell me if that's.
I'm not suggesting a narrow view. I'm just kind of asking when we would do that, and to the extent any of us might want to make those motions. I raise that because last time when I said that I wanted to raise a motion, frankly, I was accused of holding the budget hostage with a proposal. And I just want to make it clear that we might all have the opportunity to make motions with regard to individual items, having heard the broad picture. I'm hoping that will be the case. Not that I have any right now, I just want to make that clear, but I was looking for the roadmap. First, a general question, Aisha. And this really, I'm not advocating a position here. I'd just like to understand why you felt that preserving the smallest class sizes in the youngest grades was more important than preserving them in the older grades. We've seen Rice parents, for example, with regard to the older grades, that those were the children who were most affected by COVID and in greatest need of support and therefore smaller classes. And I understand their point of view on that. And I'm gathering that there's an offsetting point of view with regard to the younger children. So could you just explain where you're coming from on that?
So, research points to the importance of early intervention and the role of early educational experiences in predicting longer term outcomes. And so that's certainly a portion of things in terms of thinking about establishing the conditions for success for our youngest learners that will hopefully predict with systems in place to support them and progressing. The other thing that was important to know with regard to those changes that occurred in the upper grades where these class sizes were increased. First of all, I want to back up and say, I think all students benefit from smaller class sizes, and class sizes of 25 to 28 aren't ideal for anybody. So I want to be clear about that. Secondly, I also want to share that in doing so, we had identified several other classrooms in grades 3 through 5 that could have been increased to that same range. However, in consultation with the principals and student services, the particular needs of those cohorts of children were identified to be such that that was not recommended, and we could not move forward with making those increases. We really took a class by class look, which is hard to hear if your child's in a class that's slated to be 25 to 28, and I hear that, and I speak mama, I know, I know. But I want you to understand that there was a thoughtful process that went into looking at that, to look at precisely those sorts of circumstances that would lead us to think differently about some of the decisions that we were making, understanding that we were faced with making decisions that we wouldn't otherwise recommend.
Great. Thank you. Kathy, I wanted to go back to your comments on understanding our differences, and I just want to explain a little personal background on that. My two daughters, who are now in their 40s, had that program at Bowen way back when, and they still talk about the impact of it on their understanding of people with disabilities. It made them sensitive to those issues and empathetic, and it was a life learning experience. It was really important. What I don't quite understand is how much of this decision is based on budget versus the programmatic aspects that you've discussed, Kathy. And I guess one way to crystallize that question would be, if understanding our differences as a nonprofit, we're able to do external fundraising that would cover the entire cost of the Newton Public Schools program, would we keep it?
I think the best answer to that is that there was discussion back and forth because there is still concern about some of the curriculum units. There's more research out there about how we approach teaching about disabilities. And there was absolutely going to be thought put in and working to look at, again, the delivery model and some of the content in some of the lessons. So at this point here, it is a budget decision that we've made. If there was funding available, I think we would have to have a discussion as to the units that we felt we would move forward with. And again, still looking at the delivery model and some of the issues that we have with the curriculum. So, I'm committed to, and again, when I say I'm committed, I'm here for a short period of time. I am talking to Dr. Nolan, who had some ideas of her own. But one of the things that we would do was to keep an open dialogue and have collaboration with the group to discuss moving forward.
Great, thank you. I want to join with Emily on the strings program. Having a violist in the family, again, we experienced the benefits of those programs, and I too am concerned about the long-term impacts on the upper grades and the like. I'm also cognizant of the fact that it's really hard for us to ask you to put something back without a concomitant change in other expenses. So I'm very interested in Chris's comments and suggestions later, because his proposals sound like there would be substantial additional amounts of money potentially for the schools if they're deemed feasible. I would just say, personally, I'd be very interested in supporting the arts programs should those funds be available. I have to ask one more question, Rebecca. This is not personal at all. Trust me, it's not. It's just that it seems to me that when we're looking at cutting teaching positions, we also have an obligation to look at administrative positions. And I'm wondering, again, this is not personal, whether you've considered in having a shared principal between Ward and Underwood schools, whose combined enrollment is roughly the same as some of our larger schools that have one principal. And I say that because the enrollment patterns we've been given for the coming years are downward for both of those schools. The schools are only a mile apart, and I understand the value of having a person in the building, but some of that can be delegated as well. And did you consider a move like that?
So I would say that all of the questions about Ward and Underwood, we're well aware of the enrollment trends with Ward and Underwood, and a number of different ideas were floated, not specifically the one that you mentioned, although I want to speak to that in just a second.
What you mind?
What's that? Yeah. And I think we're on the brink right now of a community inquiry into just this issue, right? About what is the future of Ward and Underwood schools, given the current enrollment patterns right now. We have the consultant coming on board. We have the community task force that's coming on board. We have a process that's in place, slated to deliver recommendations here next December. And so this needs to be a thoughtful process. And we're committed to seeing that process through. And I think looking at the recommendations that come out of that process will be important and will have an impact, needs to have an impact, right, in terms of looking at the overall budget picture here. With regard to the shared principal idea, I can speak to this from experience, because I've been a principal in 2 buildings a mile apart before, not in Newton, but elsewhere. I've also been to the Underwood School, and I've also been to the Ward School, and I've seen the role that the principal plays in the day-to-day and the necessity of that hands-on present leadership in each building, in supporting teachers, in supporting students, and in supporting families. And so I think at this time, particularly of heightened student need, against there's a limited structure in elementary schools for support. It's part of the reason why the loss of the AP positions is particularly difficult as well, to further reduce those supports in some of our larger schools. The principal stands alone in doing a variety of functions in the school building. And so I think until we have, I would be concerned about that kind of a move.
Just one final, thank you. One final comment. I know the budget is premised on the continuation of the one-to-one computer program. And I know I'm totally in the minority on this, but my feeling on that program at the lower grades is that there's never been a rigorous analysis before the fact of if what we were trying to achieve in terms of educational results, no control experiment of having it versus not having it, no sense of a rigorous analytical approach to that. And that being the case, we are forced by the existence of that program to spend monies that might actually be used to other purposes. That's just a statement. I think everyone around the table disagrees with me on that, and I think all you do, but I just have to state it. Thank you. Thank you, Tim.
I also need to speak to the principal situation. You know, I think at one meeting I was talking, you've heard me call the principals the backbone, and I know you don't disagree with that, Paul, but you know, you have a principal sitting before you. We're in the middle of very important professional development. We don't get all our staff together as often as I'd like. And Beth had to leave to go substitute in a second grade classroom that day. Because again, needing that kind of support. But when you talk about what the expectations are for evaluating your teachers, making sure that they have the support they need, never mind calls today. We were preparing and going over, received a call about a student in really need of support with a principal. So that is just, it's interesting. I can't imagine not having assistant principals, and I don't care when you look at, 275 students in a school, to have that additional support to meet the needs of so many students. And I think being out there, and in talking, the one thing that is so evident to all of us is the connections that you have with all your families about the students, about their needs, about the communication, about the availability of the principal. So I know we're in very difficult times right now, but that is, and we can talk about a lot of things administration wise, but that is one that is just so critical.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Cove, I know you had a comment you wanted to make, but I just wanted to follow up really quickly about the Paul's process questions piece. I think my preference, because you asked what would be my preference, and I'm your chair, I'm not the committee, but I think my preference for a process would be for us to get through this meeting, us to get through our next meeting, which will be a teaching and learning update, and then followed up with the third budget meeting, the IT and library operations. And then we have placeholder meetings for us to talk, for us to put our ideas forward, for us to advocate for things that we would like to see preserved, for us to make changes and suggestions. I think those are the appropriate. And Paul, to your point, last year when you made a motion, it was during that phase of the process. So I think, sure, put your ideas on the table, but let's consider them then after we've already heard the details and had the benefit of the educational experts as to the impact of some of the changes that they're putting forward for us to consider. So that's just process.
Thank you.
Sure thing. Go ahead, Cove.
I was going to say similar things to what Kathy said about the principals, and I think that it's easy for people to say that you need to cut administrators because it doesn't feel as real as the teacher in the classroom to some people. But I think the impact of not having a principal in the building would be, as a former principal, just not a tenable situation. I also think that we need to realize that one of the major roles of principals is to evaluate teachers and to coach and to improve instruction in the classrooms. And if principals aren't able to do that in the elementary schools, there's limited other people who can do that. I mean, I assume that some curriculum directors and some other people can do that, but largely it falls to your plate. So I think it's really important that we kind of see the whole role of principals in that it's not just what the parents maybe see every day. So I think that's important.
Thanks.
Thanks, Cove. Any additional questions before we move on from you, Cove, specifically?
No.
Okay. Go ahead, Rajiv, and then on Pig.
Look, wanted to share a couple of thoughts and comments. And then Tamika wanted to respond to what you said as well in terms of process. So first, thank you. This was clearly not a fun discussions, and I appreciate the work that went into it and the very difficult proposals that you've come up with. So I know we talked a little bit about understanding our differences. We've received a lot of emails. I also have met with some of the people who have been working and volunteering for a while. I do understand that there are concerns, valid concerns about some of the modules. I also know there's a long history in Newton, which is where the program originated and where I've received many emails and calls from people, from alums of Newton Public Schools with disabilities who feel like it made a significant difference. So what I would say is there's no direction in terms of what to hold on to and what not, and what changes to make. Because as Tamika said, it makes sense for that to come at the end of the process. But what I have heard is the team at Understanding Our Differences is quite willing to make changes and updates in terms of modernizing some of the curriculum and the way things work, which was gratifying to hear. And that if that works out and if funding looks different than it does today, it would be nice to see that continue. I wanted to express concern actually about the kindergarten aides, because in terms very tactically of what happens in the classroom, kids putting their jackets on to go out to recess, getting lined up, making it out, making it back. One aide across 2 classrooms is going to be incredibly difficult. And I'm not saying I disagree with some of the other points that have come up around strings and everything else, but I feel this is an important one, because even with keeping the classroom sizes smaller at that level, which I think is, I'm glad you prioritized that. I think the actual working of the classroom, especially in New England winters and other things, is going to be difficult. So if we are able to find additional funding, certainly if we're able to think about how to bring back a little more support, that would be great. Along those lines, I know it's hard finding college interns. I don't know if Henry and Tammy have high schoolers who might be interested in volunteering or interning at the elementary schools to help, especially with the K classrooms. I don't know if we've ever explored that, but it could be a win-win on those fronts. So again, thank you for this. Tamika, what I would suggest is I agree fully with you that talking about specific cuts, putbacks, and so on within each of these sessions is going to be very difficult to do unless we've seen the entire picture. But that said, any ideas about how to increase the top line funding broadly, and then subsequently thinking about how any increase could be applied to various programs, I think would be helpful to do. So specifically not saying, well, we'd like to put something back and take something else away, but are there ways that we could find additional funding that could be used, again, in line with our recommendations to be applied kind of across the board? So if we have that kind of discussion, which based on what Chris said is potentially where he's going, I would certainly love to hear that today and get a sense of whether those are possible options for increasing the top line number of the budget, which could then cascade benefits down to other areas. So just wanted to put that out there as a proposal.
Appreciate that. And I think the most appropriate and respectful way to make sure we as a school committee can have that part of the conversation is to do so after the presentations. We know that these folks have a lot of responsibilities and that their day starts particularly early.
So certainly after this presentation,
Yes.
I just meant not after the 3 days.
I hear you. And again, that would be under the category of us just marinating in each other's good ideas and things that we want to consider at the top. I think that's fine. Sure. All set, Rajiv? Okay, Anping, go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, I think still it's important to acknowledge the very difficult time, even though we said many times, but I still want to say one more time, and I appreciate Cassie's, you put up, organize the team and to put this budget within such a short time. And this is very, very difficult. And I assume it's not common, you present 2 budget proposal before the override, and then now reality set in, and we have this budget, and very difficult. And you folks all on the receiving end of this budget proposal, because committee, many people are not happy, and you are on the front line to receive all those critical comments. And I like to acknowledge this is very difficult. And certainly, as Ayashi and already said that it's a difficult decision for you guys. No one would like to be in that position to cut these positions. So I want to say one more time that really appreciate your tremendous efforts. And also I like to acknowledge your consideration of this budget. And I think it's important to share with the community, when you think about how to cut those programs, you have your guidelines and what kind of things you want to keep, and specifically to maintain the current level of services, and also provide sustainable budget for the future years. I think that's important. And also I share with my colleagues 2 primary concerns I think we have heard a lot from community: the musical elective programs at elementary school level, and UOD, understanding our differences. Both my kids did the musical programs, and I was I could share with you, more than 30 years ago when I was in the graduate program, I learned about understanding our differences. And I was so impressed, I decided to do a project to interview the founders of the program and to write not dissertation, but quite a serious, research project on this program. The reason I was so impressed because this is the committee initiated, and parents got organized and tried to work with schools to educate our students. I think this model itself is very significant. It's more than just simple school program. It has a lot of meaning and got a lot of attention, statewide, even nationally, I understand. And every year I received the invite to celebrate and to fundraising. I thought this is a great model, and I will be very sad to see if this program, stopped and possibly will never come back. This is very difficult even to imagine. And I appreciate that Paul and Rajiv mentioned that if any way we can fundraising and bring back, or, revise a little bit here and there and have some discussion. And because again, the meaning of this program is more than just a simple school program, way more than that. So I appreciate that if we can work together to do something. And also, I share the Rajiv's concern about this, 15.3 FTE kindergarten assistants. We talked a little bit among our school committees executive session, but I think it's good for the community to know how we would come to this decision. And I know it's not probably a prepared analogy to compare with shared principal or 2 schools, 1 principal run to 2 schools, but it's a little bit similar. If we say 1 assistant per 2 classes, it was a little bit difficult for me to conceptualize how the 1 assistant could work with 2 classes, and we all know that kindergarten classes students are not easy to take care of. And I remember my son had ADHD in kindergarten class. was very difficult at both schools. And this is a sad story, but I could still share with everybody. My son's kindergarten teacher, as a matter of fact, suicide, and she killed herself and become big news at both school. Probably, I don't know, 30 years ago. And we all attend the school, meeting, and everybody talk about that. Boston Globe had a frontline story. And for one reason, she could not handle the class. I heard she said she yelled at class. My son was one of kids she yelled at. Unfortunately, my son was, I even had a conference with her just a few weeks before she killed herself. And that stayed in my mind many, many years. It's difficult. But anyway, so that part, probably you could help to explain a little bit how with the new model, if that will be the reality, one assistant will be working with two classes. So
I think it's important to start by just reiterating too, that the model, it's understandable that it would be difficult to imagine how to do it, because this is how we imagined the model to work. We imagined a kindergarten program that had full-time aides in the classroom. And I think it's reasonable. I think that it will have an impact. I can't say that it won't. Going back to the considerations, as we examined what the available positions were, what were the areas for potential savings within the elementary cost center, and the variety of considerations that I put before you, including those that would yield, that were structural changes that could yield the kind of change needed to move us to a more stable place. That unfortunately is one of the places. I feel like it's like, what's the package you get? If we would have been able to put a different package forward for you, had the override passed and we had a different funding level, we could give you the package that included a variety of things that we really value and that we as educators think are really important, that we want for our kids, that we vision for our kids. And unfortunately, we don't have those funds. So we're having to put together a package that isn't the package that we envisioned or that we wanted. And it's going to require us to think about how to operationalize these changes, right? This is where principals are going to be working with their teams to say, what is the schedule, to coordinate, to say, how does this person work between two classrooms? When are they here? When are we there? How do we coordinate recess so everyone's doing their coats at the same time? It's going to take another level of thinking about the execution of making it happen. And it's not the picture that's not the package that we wanted. The other thing what was I going to say about? We did reach out to a variety of other districts to look at what options, how were other districts operating. And as you would expect, some of our area districts have exactly the model that we do right now. They have the one-to-one aides in their kindergarten classrooms with similar class sizes. And yet others have found ways to do either without them or have a split model similar to this. So we know that we can learn from some of our colleagues as well. Though I'll be clear that it wasn't the preferred option, that I would have liked to have put forward a package that included everything that we have on the table right now.
Okay.
I don't know if you have anything you want to say about the.
I just want to add the impact that the kindergarten assistants have on the day-to-day basis within the school is hard to define. They take care of the kids' safety. They greet the kids in the morning. They make sure that at the end of the day, they're matched up with their caregivers. And in the classroom, the amount of small group instruction that they support, the social emotional supports that they provide, the instructional supports that they provide, are really hard to measure. However, as Aisha said, this is nothing that we wanted to come that we're proud to present, but it was given a most difficult task to come up with a budget that would help close the presenting gap. I just want to thank the team. I think that Aisha did a really nice job of providing time since October for us to think about how to tackle this. And again, none of these are things that we're proud to put forward, but it's something that is a must do. But I just wanted to say that like, the kindergarten assistants do a lot in terms of all the other positions that within that circle graph that we highlighted.
Just let me summarize. I might be a little bit pushing a little bit hard, but currently we're probably, we are thinking more operational sense, mean how to cut the budget to make sure we have the money for the school proposal, but how to rationalize our decision probably take a little bit longer time. When people ask you, how could you make this decision? You know, you cannot say it's money. No, more than that. And so we have our considerations. We said we want to keep integrity of our education programs. Then people say, okay, what do you mean by keeping the integrity of program if you cut these positions without explaining how did you come to this decision? I know it's a little bit early at this time, but I felt I have to ask the question. Lastly, I like to follow up with Rajiv's proposal, or Paul and other people mentioned that to fund the intern. And I'm wondering if we could even say if parents willing to be volunteers in a kindergarten class to help, whether it's possible legally, procedurally, I don't know. There are a lot of regulations. Probably you have to have some kind of training license, but I want to put this proposal there. And I'm quite sure that there will be some volunteers who are willing to help out, just put out. And lastly, I agree. I'm very anxious to hear what Chris will say about, cutting the school budget, whatever the ideas. Probably we don't need to wait until very end of or discussion, 3 proposals. So that's just my opinion. Thanks.
Thanks, Ping. Oh, go ahead, Kathy.
So I have a question for you folks, sort of following up on this kindergarten aid discussion, and it may be that I'm just wrong about this, but my understanding is that before FY20, we didn't have kindergarten aides. The kindergarten aides were a new creation when we eliminated the half day, the afternoon program. And so when we went to the full day kindergarten model. And so I completely understand why we added them and the value that those folks provide in maintaining the small group instruction aspect. But I guess my question is, if we ran kindergarten classrooms on the day and a half, like the old model, before we went to full day kindergarten, we ran our kindergarten classrooms without kindergarten then. Is what we're really losing the small group instruction components rather than the putting on your coat and going out to recess components? Because they didn't used to do that before, and we survived somehow. Do you understand what I'm asking? Like, what is it that, where is the value? Is it really in the getting everybody out to recess and just organizing a bunch of 5-year-olds? Or is it really I'm going to do reading and writing with you on the small group basis that your teacher used to do with you? Like,
Right.
Where's the value?
Yeah, I mean, I think the value isn't all of that, for sure. I was on the early childhood committee, when we've changed the model actually 2 different times in 30 years. And I think we recognized when we were going to be going to a full day kindergarten program for every kindergartner, as opposed to the 2.5 day program we had before, that we wanted to capitalize on that time, right? We wanted to have that time be as rich as it could be and meaningful as it could be. And to Aisha's point, the value of that early intervention and that support that we give our youngest children, we want to capitalize on that, right? So having the addition of a full-time kindergarten assistant allows us to do that. We have that extra person who is seen as a co-teacher. These are very skilled, very talented people who often are looking to get their master's in education or have many years of experience, maybe in a private setting, and are coming to public school setting. So they're very skilled and very dedicated, and we can rely on them to deliver instruction to our smallest children in the classroom. Because if you imagine, having kindergartners write independently is not an easy thing, right? So knowing to have that second pair of hands really is critical for that instruction. So that's sort of what I wanted to share, that perspective a little bit on that.
I think along with that, let's not forget about the context that we're operating in too. We've been talking about the level of need. and students coming into kindergarten now with a wider range of need than we had seen in years prior as well. And that all contributes to thinking about how do you set up the model, right? The model of support that is that you'd like to see that is indicative of the premier district of Newton versus what we're able to do right now. And I think the intervention and foundational support, and I use the word intervention, and I think intervention is part of it, but that foundational support for all learners coming in from the start is part of what we think about too, in terms of what kinds of experiences we're providing.
And I think that's really valuable. Like all three of my kids went through the old model before the institution of full day kindergarten. And while they didn't have the full days, they survived without aids. Their kindergarten classes functioned pretty well, but their afternoons were very different. And that is when they did their writing and their social studies. And so it's interesting to think about, given the changes that you've made in the last 3 years, what support needs are necessary because of those changes. I think it's helpful for everybody whose kids are old.
Thanks, Kathy. Any additional questions? Chris, Mayor Fuller? Questions, comments? No. Well, from my perspective, there's just a couple of things that I did want to circle back on. On Ping's question around how we would make the 1 aid per 2 classes work. I think we've addressed that quite a lot, but that was something that kind of struck me as being a challenge and sounds like one that you folks are still needing some time to figure out how to implement that. Paul, I actually, for slightly different reasons, I think the one-to-one technology at these grades, if I'm looking dollars and cents and thinking, where do I want our resources deployed? That's something I would say it's good to have, but it's not necessary to have. And the reasons why it is good to have is it's a tool that you educators use to differentiate instruction, to curate different experiences for students based on their needs. That's something that we need to do, and certainly that our communities expressed a deep need for us to improve on. So on one hand, I could say we should eliminate our technology at those levels, but on the other hand, it helps us to improve the excellence of our delivery. So I don't know. I'm just saying you aren't exactly out in the cold on that one entirely. For understanding our differences, I think we've all kind of shown and talked about how that one really does land. It lands. It's a really venerable program. Many of us have deep connections to it. I've been a parent volunteer in it. I think that the program itself is heavily dependent on parent volunteers, and some parents, might study the instruction manuals and the materials and do a really competent, wonderful job. Others, I can see maybe skirting that and that being problematic from your perspective. I think the aspects of the programs that are the best and the most impactful for our students are some of the things that Emily talked about, the hearing from a person with a particular disability and being able to be empathetic and understanding and respectful to that person and ask them whatever question, do you like baseball, that the kids come up with. I think that was really a crucial part of the program. So finding ways to both embed the curriculum, but also finding those enrichment opportunities that really drive home the messages and the learning, that would be where I would want to see that your efforts go. I don't know what it looks like, neither do you at this point, but that's just my 2 cents. And that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Becca. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Aisha, very much.
Next, we'll have Assistant Superintendent Toby Roma and his team.
Good evening, everybody. I have some wing people here as well. Join me
I know.
from the secondary principal team representing our larger group tonight. We have Henry Turner, principal of Newton North, Tammy Strauss, principal of Newton South, Jackie Mann, principal of the FA Day, and Kim Lysa from Charles E. Brown Middle School. Very glad to have them with us. We're going to continue the presentation with the secondary portion for tonight. Follow a similar pattern to what Aisha and the elementary school principals did as well. And take questions at the end of that. And if it's helpful to loop back to any other elementary or other topics, I know there's other topics for discussion then as well. We can do that. So just a reminder of the overview of changes we did present. Kathy presented last Wednesday, summarizing the major changes to the secondary budgets, which includes both middle and high school. You can see that here, increasing the team and class sizes, other reductions and some small additions, and summarizing the impact here. We're going to get into much more detail on this as we move forward. As you know, and again, parallel to the elementary level, the basis for any of the changes we make in staffing for our schools is enrollment. So I want to quickly first review the enrollment changes for middle school and then high school. So the total projection this year for our middle schools is 2,632 students. That's a decrease of 140 students for middle school. This decrease is entirely accounted for with the relative size of our exiting 8th grade class and our entering 6th grade class coming up from 5th grade. So you can see the slightly above 5th grade level math problem that's there on the slide. 995 minus 850. So that's a difference of 145. And then there's some, additional projected changes that make the actual projected difference 140 students for our middle school enrollment last year to this year. Looking out into the future, that brings our middle school enrollment to a fairly stable level over the next 4 to 5 years in that 2,600 range. So that's helpful to know going forward. There'll be stability there with our enrollment. At the high school level, this is the one area where we're still seeing increases in enrollment within the district as our bubbles of larger students move through the district. So 4,030 students projected 9 through 12 in our postgraduate programs at the high schools next year. That's an increase of 83 students. The important part of that to note as well is actually the increase from our projection for this current school year. So we're actually 20 students over our projection already, which is the level that the high schools are staffed for. So that difference of actually 103 students over this year's projections are important when we start looking at high school staffing. So we'll move into the middle schools now and thinking about the enrollment driven reductions for middle school. So each of these portions we'll talk about as Aisha did, enrollment driven reductions or changes, and then budget driven changes. So with that 140 students decrease at the middle school level, you can see how that's distributed across our 4 middle schools, and then how we would reduce the FTE if we're working only with a change in enrollment. It's important to note here, there's no change in this base budget to the Bigelow staffing based on the school committee's budget guidelines, which asked us to leave staffing there intact. And again, based on the changes we made to the school districts and the enrollment projections going forward, we look to see the Bigelow enrollment stabilize and then increase in the coming years based on the changes. So that's what we have there. If we just had these enrollment decreases at the middle school, we would be decreasing 1/2 team or creating a 2-person team at Brown Middle School, and similarly at Day Middle School with those smaller incoming 6th grade classes, and then a slight adjustment of 1 teacher to the 8th grade team configuration at Oak Hill. So these are the changes we'd be making barring any budget reductions that might be necessary. So then created a similar graphic or pulled up a similar graphic to the one that the elementary folks use to try to illustrate the different areas of resources that exist in the middle schools. And again, understanding that not all these areas are within the secondary general education budget that I'll be presenting on tonight, but it's helpful to understand the different pieces of the puzzle that make up a middle school and understanding where we can look to make reductions. And in this case, particularly to make sustainable reductions over the next several years, not expecting a significant increase in budgetary allocations in the near future, based on the override, based on other factors. So you can see we've already highlighted here in yellow the areas that we're going to be talking about where reductions were made based on our budget shortfall at the middle school level. So that area there in the core is our teacher teams, which are the core of content teaching, as well as our multi-team teachers, the large oval at the bottom of the center area. So that's where our class size reductions will be seen that we mentioned already. Looking at that, the areas, you know, there's a logic to the visual here, right? And the areas surrounding that central area are areas typically where we're supporting the instruction happening in the core. Instructional support in general education in the top right is in an area that took a significant cut already last year. General ed literacy specialists, reading support, and the little math intervention for general ed students we had there is being significantly cut last year. And in fact, we're able to make a small reduction, a small increase to our literacy support, a slight additional decrease to math intervention. And then you'll see a couple more areas there in the yellow highlights where additional reductions were made in special ed teachers and assistants on the right of the slide. 10% reduction to extracurriculars on the bottom that we'll talk about, administration, assistant principal role in student services, and a district-wide student service administrator who supported middle schools as well as high schools. We thought long and hard about many of the other areas on this slide, and what you'll hear more from some of my colleagues were these areas who cover these areas in their budgets as well. But it was really important to us in looking at creating a budget that was sustainable, a budget that allowed us to move forward with predictability in the future to ensure that we maintained a lot of the supports around the classrooms, and knowing the increasing student needs. Certainly our therapeutic supports and our counseling supports were crucial to maintain those around our classes, regardless of class size and with increasing class size. And as many of the additional supports around our schools, including infrastructure and administrative support, to be able to continue to offer the solid programs that we do, not reduce any of the programs wholly, but making minor reductions. So let me go more into the details of what that looks like at the middle school. So with the additional budgetary limitations, the numbers that we worked off to create the size and scope of reductions necessary while still maintaining our academic program across the board was to increase maximum team sizes at the middle school from 90 to 100. Along with this comes proportional additional reductions to our multi-team teaching staff. That multi-team, if you're not familiar, includes world language, fine and applied arts, PE, health, wellness. And the team teachers, of course, is English, mathematics, science, and social studies. So you can see here in the table, the larger wide column in the center outlines the additional reductions of staffing to each of the middle schools based on that target of maximizing team sizes at 100. We did preserve either 4 or 2-person teams at all of our schools. For those of you here last year, remember, we initially proposed creating some 3-person teams, which were very challenging to do while still having content expertise and licensure for all our teachers in all our areas. So there are no 3-person teams here, just 4 and 2-person teams, which ensures that all teachers are licensed in the area that they're teaching. And if you're not familiar, 2-person teams typically will have one teacher doing the humanities subjects, English and social studies, and a second doing the math and science subjects. And we're lucky enough to have recruited and retained a number of, look at my middle school principals over here, teachers with dual licensure that allow us to have 2-person teams when necessary and where appropriate. So you can see that additional 11 team teachers and 3.7 multi-team teachers are the budget-driven reductions at the bottom of the center column. Adding that to the decrease of 5 staff FTEs based on enrollment from the previous slide, a total there of 19.7 FTE reduced in teaching staff at the middle school. There is a small increase, a restoration of a cut made last year to the literacy specialist role. So that's a 1.0 FTE, which is shared across the small schools. So it's actually a very small increase in resources for each of the schools, but knowing the increasing needs of our students for reading intervention, knowing with slightly larger class sizes in our middle schools, it would be important to add at least a minimal amount of additional support. That's where we chose to do that. Again, there is no reduction to our school counseling staff or therapeutic staff at the middle school, very important, and another small additional enrollment of a 0.5 FTE assistant principal for student services at Day. Looking at what that means for each of the middle schools, you can see on this slide outline of what that looks like. The Bigelow shifting from just having one 2-person team to having two 2-person teams, and the resulting reduction in multi-team staffing. Brown across its 3 grades would be reducing from having typically 3 teams per grade to having 2.5 teams per grade, or 2 4-person teams and 1 2-person teams. And again, in each of the schools, there's a proportional reduction to the multi-team staffing that goes with that. There's also a part-time math support position that we were able to maintain at Brown at last year that we would be reducing this year. At Day, we'd be reducing from 3.5 teams in each of the 3 grades down to 3 teams, 3 4-person teams. And Day is also, as I mentioned, a decrease in the halftime assistant principal for student services. Oak Hill would be reduced, making reductions to its 2 1/2 teams in the 7th and 8th grade across those 2 grades, again, with a multi-team. And I haven't mentioned this yet, but in all our schools, at the middle school level, a 10% reduction in funding for the staffing, stipends, and other salaries that support our extracurricular program. So that includes our middle school athletics program, our after-school enrichment program, where a lot of our clubs and activities take place, and then our music and drama support as well. We also have that slight increase in the literacy support, which would be shared across the 4 schools. Looking at the impact of this on our team sizes, you can see here the average team size for this current school year, FY23 for each school, the increase in the average team size in the second column. And so the district-wide average going from an average team size of 85 students up to 93, and then the maximum team sizes for each of the middle schools there as well. We are, while doing this, maintaining the school counseling ratios, as I mentioned, also ensuring that all students on these teams have access to the full range of arts classes, language classes, and extracurricular classes, extracurricular opportunities that they would have with those 10% reductions to the support. And also noting, you see the slightly less significant impact on Bigelow. It was important and as stated in the budget guidelines, to maintain an equitable middle school experience for all 4 of the middle schools. So there is some difference in how these reductions are impacting Bigelow based on the smaller size and inability to take the full size of the reductions the other schools are taking. And again, we've discussed the reductions to extracurriculars already. I'll shift now to our discussion of high school and then open it up to questions on both of these areas. So as we mentioned before, high school is going to look a little bit different because our enrollment driven changes are increases to staffing. And so in calculating this year's budget, we started by calculating the increasing staffing that our high schools would have had with an increase of 103 students beyond the level that they're currently staffed for. And so it's important that 103 is not distributed evenly across North and South. So Newton South would have 29 more students than it was projected for this year, and Newton North 74 more students than projected for this year. So with that, we distribute the increase of 5.5 FTE based on the enrollment increase across those schools in proportion to the increase in the enrollments. Important to note, these base budget enrollments, before we start talking about budget reductions, don't make up for the cuts that were made to the high school staffing last year with our enrollment changes as well. So that would be an adjustment from where we are now. We already had built in some significant cuts. Oftentimes in reduction processes, our largest schools are able to take a larger share of the reductions because they're able to absorb those changes a little bit more efficiently on the margins. But that takes its toll over time. And I certainly think that's part of the pattern that we're seeing at the high schools. And so that influenced some of the levels that we're talking about here in the reductions for this year. So a similar, not quite as pretty graphic of all of the parts of the roles and staffing that make up the high schools and seeing how those fit together. Again, that instructional core in the center with our mesh wool departments and smaller departments in career and tech ed, where we're making significant adjustments this year in looking at the budget reductions, which I'll talk about next. There's also some reductions in other areas in high school, special education teachers. There's a reduction to custodians that Liam will talk about in his presentation a week from today. And again, based on the size of our high schools, the growing enrollment, and reductions to many of the other areas supporting our core instruction areas are not advisable at this time, given the intensity and need of our students. So that's what you'll see in what I'll talk about next. So the budget-driven reductions, again, there's a chart here with 2 columns to explain how that plays out. So a total reduction of 7.7 FTE to the high school levels based on the budget shortfalls, distributed based on the relative size of Newton North and Newton South in the first column there, next to the school names. And then the added 5.5 FTE based on enrollment increases yields a total decrease of 2.5 FTE. There's also a 0.2 FTE reduction to career and tech ed. Last year, we started phasing out the design visual arts program, and they were 0.8 of that FTE was cut last year, another 0.2 cut this year. And again, at the high school level, there's a 10% reduction to extracurricular activity support. Again, high school athletics stipends and other funds. Our after-school clubs, which are primarily supported through stipends for staff members, and theater and music stipends as well. In terms of the impact and what that will mean for the high schools, if you again remember the process from last year and in past years, our high school scheduling and course creation and assignments happens after this budget process is approved based on student course selections. But nonetheless, you're looking at much smaller reductions for the high school level, but I don't want to underestimate the impact that they may have based on the previous reductions and the increase in enrollment that's happening at the same time. But Henry and Tammy can talk about this in much more detail, but some text here just to illustrate the different kinds of shifts we may see in April and May once we're able to finalize our course requests and put the staffing in place to maximize the courses based on student requests, but definitely currently at 28% high school classes with 25 or more students. We expect that number to increase significantly. We're concerned about students getting their first choice of electives and additional core courses that they may sign up for. Perhaps second science courses, or oftentimes juniors and seniors are interested in those. Will be very difficult to schedule those. We expect wait lists for some of our most sought after upper class courses and electives if we're not able to offer additional sections when requests are high for those. And then courses with smaller enrollments wherever possible will not be offered, so we can maximize staffing. Again, school counseling ratios and our other support positions are maintained, just given the increasing student needs, knowing the increasing enrollment as well as a part of that. So quick just overview of the total impact here. 18.2 FTE total change at the middle school level, 2.4 at the high school level, 20.6 FTE total across the 2 levels. And again, this is just totaling the FTE and dollar changes to the secondary department budgets. Again, many other departments whose budgets support the work of our high schools that we'll hear about more in the coming days. And I think with that, I'm sure you have lots of questions. We're happy to provide more detail. If there's questions we can't answer tonight, we will take note of that and get back to you with that information at one of our future meetings. So I'll open it up there.
Great. Thank you. Questions from our members? I'll look to this side first, since I looked over there previously. All right, go ahead, Richie.
First, at Day Middle School, the 0.5 FTE reduction in the assistant principal role, is that going from 1 to 0.5 or 0.5 to 0?
So that's at Day Middle, so that's what from 1.5 to 1.0. With yep.
Rajiv, can you pull your mic?
Sorry. Could I repeat the question? The question was regarding the reduction in the assistant principal position at Day Middle School and what the starting and ending and endpoints were. And Toby, I think everyone heard your response.
Yeah.
The other question is around the reductions in extracurricular activities and support for stipends. Do I understand it correctly that we're not cutting specific programs or extracurriculars? We're doing an across the board, at least for now, across the board reduction in the resources available.
Yes, that's right. And so a good portion of those reductions are on stipend amounts that are contractually negotiated. So the amount of the stipend for a coach or for an after-school club advisor, that won't change. There'll have to be either fewer coaches, fewer clubs offered. And then our athletic directors have already spent significant time. Henry and Tammy could talk about it in a little more detail if that's helpful, in other ways to incorporate those reductions into the current athletic offerings, and what would have to give to do that.
And just to that point, the proposed increases in fees is something that Liam would be covering. It's not included in here, correct?
Yes, yeah, and my understanding is we think of those as general offsets to the total operating budget and not specifically to certain line items. Yeah.
Thank you.
All set, Reggie?
Yes.
Sorry, I was distracted there. I noticed we have one of our student reps in the room tonight, and so I'm going to give you a moment to think about it. But if you have a question, just let me know and you can come up to one of the mics, and we apologize for not having the room set up for you. Next time, let us know when you're coming. Any other questions? Go ahead, Reggie, or Anping, and then I'll swing over this way. Emily and Paul.
Thank you, Tamika. I'm kind of relieved that seems the cut is not as significant as the elementary school level. I could be wrong, but at least I did not see any program cut, outright program cut so far. Here I have a little bit question, or I'd like to get more information about impact at the high school level. Higher waiting list for sought after upper class courses and courses and electives. So what's the current situation if students, I know that I heard those stories, even including my daughter at that time trying to, register for some course, but so what's current status? And if we will increase this waiting list, might be some concern to some parents. So I just want to hear a little bit more about the current situation and what could be worse.
Yeah, I'm gonna suggest before we go to high school, and I know Tammy, you can probably take that one. Maybe either Jackie or Kim want to talk about what some of the impact will be at middle school from your point of view, because I think maybe we're not articulating ourselves clearly if you're not feeling if you're not seeing that there.
Thanks, Toby. Thanks, Anping. Good to see everyone. I think it's harder to understand at the middle school level because we have a team-based learning. I'm looking at an FTE of over 18 positions. For me at Day Middle School, it's my 6th year as a principal at Day Middle School. And I remember learning the most important thing a leader can do at an educational facility like Day is to hire good people. And I've spent 6 years hiring phenomenal people, and I'm losing many of them in the past 6 years that represent the diversity of our student body, because that's been another initiative that we focused on. So you're taking some of the best and brightest, and Newton is giving them away, to be perfectly frank. And what it means is that higher class sizes at the middle school level. It also breaks apart what we call grade level departments and teams that are highly effective and highly impactful on student learning. And we're moving those folks around. So those teams that be working and functioning together are being disrupted. And so it's a little bit more significant than I think what can be sort of portrayed on that level. The last piece I'll say, to go to Raju's point about the extracurricular activities, one of the things I hear from day parents all the time is, you are such a large school, why don't you offer more extracurricular opportunities? And it's because we're trying to entice very tired teachers that are working to support children that have many needs to stay after school and invest in after school activities. And many of them do, but we're talking about cutting back on the number of coaches. So we have over 150 students that come out for our track team at day. We need a lot of coaches for that, but this means that we're going to have to cap the number of students that are able to participate in our track program. At middle school, they're sort of trying things on for size, figuring out what they're good at, what they're passionate about. And we're taking away those opportunities for kids to do that. Oh, Kim, I don't know if you want to. We're kind of in sync.
All right, you want to talk a little bit about the waiting list and some of the other course impacts?
Absolutely. So all of the classes that we land up running for the next year really depend on what our class enrollment is, right? So that's the process that we're going through right now. We just had verification day this past Monday. So we're still in the process of looking at our numbers, but honest and truly, there is no year that we actually have the ability to offer every kid exactly what they want. That's just not a possibility in the way that we're structured. So what that really means is if we have about 60 students right now, I'm just going to use tech ed as an example, who are not going to get seats in tech ed, in tech and engineering, because that is their first choice elective, but we just don't have the option to do it because there are limitations on how many students are allowed per class. So it's not even a simple matter of, oh, we can go from like 22 to 30. That's a safety hazard. We can't do that. So we have to keep those class sizes down. So that's just one specific example. In terms of first choice electives, we have a lot of students requesting visual arts. We do not have currently, even without any cuts, we do not have the staffing in visual arts to satisfy all of the, I think it's 280 something requests that we have.
And I would just add that this statement includes our senior electives, which one of the great things about being a senior is that you get to choose most of your classes. And Kobe, I know you were asking about the calculus data, calculus data. One of the interesting things about math over the last several years is the increase of statistics courses. So about 8 years ago, we had about 80 students taking AP statistics. This next year, we have registered 260 students for AP statistics. That's about 30 more students than we have currently enrolled this year. So if we were to, we had about, I think, 40 students on the wait list this year. And so if we just ran the same number of sections as we have this year, we're gonna have about 70 students on the wait list for AP statistics. So that's kind of like that's where we're sort of really seeing our tension points are in our most popular courses like AP Psychology, AP Statistics. We're really seeing that we're going to probably have a very, very high wait list.
So natural question, do you think this will increase, you use the word tension, I mean anxiety among parents? Oh gee, now this long wait list, I got to act faster, or of course, you have some, grumbling parents said, what are you talking about? My kids cannot do this course. So if we already have quite some waiting lists already, and this could possibly, depending on the real enrollment number, right? We don't know exactly, but if the word goes out, people might have some anxious feelings. So what kind of things we can say to the parents?
So it's we don't just handpick who takes what classes. So it's run through our student information system, Aspen. But what we would anticipate is that students, in our STEM classes, so we have many students who are taking multiple math courses, like calculus and statistics or data science. We have many students, I've seen actually increases over the last few years of kids taking 3 science classes in their senior year. And so that may be where we start to see a reduction of students not being able to get all of those that they're requesting. We also see a high number of juniors requesting AP statistics. It's one of the few APs that are open to them. And so priority is given through our algorithm, priority is given to seniors. And so you're going to see a higher number of juniors not being able to get those requests. So I think certainly this is, probably one of the biggest criticisms that I regularly hear is that we tell families that what you sign up for now is the last, there's no switching after just had verification day last week. We really hold it because this is how we build out our staffing. And we have many, we have many kids asking in the fall, I changed my mind. And we really hold the line there because this is how we build out our staffing. What I worry about next year is that we're going to have students with, they will have the minimum number of courses, but they may have fewer or they may have more free blocks than they had hoped for. And I know for some of our upperclassmen, they are looking to fill their schedule for a variety of reasons, whether it's college play, college competitiveness, or so they can have some more free blocks their senior year, whatever it is that, we do worry a little bit about that.
Thanks.
Thanks, Anping. Max, do you want to come up and share the mic with Cove and ask your question?
Yeah, obviously, you've spoken about how the schools will kind of decide what they're going to cut specifically once the budget is passed. So it's kind of hard to ask some of the questions about that ahead of time. I was just wondering, you guys have spoken about kind of certain classes that are being cut at the high school level. And I feel like there's kind of two different types of electives almost. There's the very kind of the rigorous AP kind of more upperclassmen centered electives. And there's obviously the other ones. You have your intro to business, kind of art-based courses that are kind of less rigorous, but more extracurricular based, I would say. I was wondering if there's any kind of, based on the kind of teachers that will be there, if one of those two groups of extracurriculars will be disproportionately affected, such as if the kind of the less rigorous extracurriculars will see more cuts. So that's kind of, I would really like to hear something about that.
Sure, that's a great question. So last year, as you know, we also took cuts at the high school level, and at South, we did not cut any of those elective courses or departments, if you will, our smaller department. It was shouldered by our larger departments that we call Meshwell, so math, English, science, and world languages and history. This year, unfortunately, I don't know if I can make that happen 2 years in a row. I don't think it's right, and I don't think it's fair. But also I understand that cutting 0.25 or 0.5 out of a English department that has 22 or 23 people is less impactful, if you will, than cutting the same number or close to it, a 0.2 or a 0.4 from a department that has, if you're talking about family and consumer sciences, 4 or 5 people total, right? So that is disproportionate. So we are lucky in the conversations that we're having on the South side, where we have some staff members who incredibly are looking at taking some voluntary leaves to help out their colleagues, because that's kind of where we are at. So there will be some cuts to the smaller departments. But like Dr. Turner said, we are really looking at some of those students who are taking those 2 or 3 classes. And Anping, just to go back to what Dr. Turner was saying and like responding to you very slightly, our department heads do an incredible job of really looking at who's asking for what courses, and make sure that if you are really interested in science and you have 2 courses on your schedule, you're going to get at least one of them, right? And they're very, very careful about that. They don't do it randomly, and it's not just a computer that's doing it. They're going through every single student and having conversations with them. So that, unfortunately, while I can't tell you the exact number and what classes that would be, I will tell you that there will be a little bit of a cut in our smaller departments this year, only because I don't think it's not equitable to not do that this year when they were not touched last year.
I mean, this is Newton, and we try to protect our fine and performing arts. I mean, it's one of the hallmarks of our high schools in our district. We have seen a decline in students signing up for music, for example, and we've held strong for a number of years, despite declining numbers in like choral programs, for example, to make sure that we're providing those offerings. And I agree with Tammy that, that we are facing that tension right now. How do we protect where we're seeing, choral essentially is declining around the country. And how do we protect those kinds of programs despite the declining numbers, but we have the value that they're important to our schools and to our students. So I'm not sure I'm using that as one example. I'm not sure which of our elective programs we may have an impact in terms of reductions, but it certainly is harder and harder to protect the smaller programs that meet the need of an important group of our students. Design and visual communications was a great example of it. Last year, where we had to cut a very, very special program that really was unique to our district in comparison to surrounding communities.
Thanks, Max. Really good question. Emily, and then Kathy, and then Paul.
Hi. So a couple things. First and foremost, thank you for protecting the middle school and high school guidance counselors, the counseling services, and how important it has been to protect the SEL work that's going across not just at middle and high school, but also in the elementary as well. So I know it probably wasn't an easy decision with all the other priorities, but I think it's an important one. And for one, I'm happy that you've made it. What's funny on Ping is that my comment about middle school was going to be, it feels like it's being disproportionately affected as opposed to the high schools and the elementary schools. So it's just funny that we're coming at this from a slightly different perspective. I hear you, Jackie, in terms of that. And I understand that there's also a disproportionate higher number of students where enrollment has gone down. And I get that. But I'm just concerned with the number of the two-person teams that we're seeing as opposed to the 4. And I don't have an alternative suggestion to it other than to say, keep track and do the best that you can. But I was a little heartsick when I saw that, I have to say. So that's 2. And then I'm actually going to follow up something for both of you that Toby referred to. So I'm going to actually flat out ask, which is, what is the process about the 10% reductions for the after school activities and the extracurriculars? Because I think about the smaller, kind of quirky, cool, awesome things that exist in the high schools that are very important to not a huge number of people, but are to a smaller number of people, but are still central to their high school experience. And so I'm just wondering how that process is going to work.
Yeah, so a couple parts to touch on a couple things you said. First of all, was just checking the numbers. There's not an increased number of two-person teams. They're shifting from certain grades to others. And maybe I'll ask Kim if you want to talk a little bit about two-person teams and four-person teams. We feel equally confident in the outstanding middle school education that students get from 2- and 4-person teams. So there's no value difference for us in those. I don't know if you want to just briefly mention a little bit about that.
Sure, absolutely. So the two-person teams, we've had them in the past at Brown, and there are some positives that come with it. Trying to look at to be optimistic about things. You've got 2 adults who work very closely together with a smaller group of kids, and sometimes that feels more of a surrounding way of educating a child. There is the counterpoint of that, which is socially, kids might feel, why am I on the 2-person team? I would prefer to be with more people. And so there is going to be a push-pull for that. And families may not be happy with a 2-person team, especially as they get up to the older grades, 8th grade particularly. But as far as the curriculum goes, there is some rich stuff that can happen. A humanities teacher can integrate what they're teaching between social studies and ELA, same thing with math and science. So there are some, benefits sometimes to that, but there are also some limitations. But I also want to add, it's a big hit right now that the faculty is taking, and I want to just reiterate what Jackie said. We're losing some really, really talented young teachers.
So the second part of your question was about how are we going to absorb the 10% reductions for both athletics and other areas? So we went to Mike Jackson and Pat Gonzalez, as we saw this possibility coming, and asked them to start doing the research and look at what would the reductions look like for this reduction. So they've done some work. None of it is finalized yet, and that they still want to see what some of the enrollments, how many students are coming out for different sports, what different scheduling needs are. I'll let you guys speak about it more, but they've been really creative in thinking about ways to make those reductions without directly impacting the quantity of opportunities we have for students. So for example, decreasing the number of away scrimmages saves money. So if we can scrimmage with local teams that are, you know, here in Newton or nearby versus taking a bus to need to go to play, you know, the top basketball team in the state in Western Mass as part of our scrimmage or a preseason non-league game, that can save money while still having a great basketball program. Reducing the number of varsity assistant coaches in some sports, it'll decrease the ratios for a lot of those programs, but allows us to still offer the programs that we have. Looking at some of the funds that go to, you guys could talk about the intramural programs between seasons, the fitness and conditioning that are super important to having good programs, but will allow us to continue. But then at the end of the day, to get to 10%, there's some more significant decreases that have to be made to the number of opportunities for students to participate. So I'll let you guys talk more about what they're working on. Mike there.
Go ahead, but I think Toby covered most of it.
Maybe I took all the good ones.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only pieces to add on for that is like Toby said, I think the biggest bang for our buck was coming from certain sports, just safety reasons because of numbers. We have multiple assistant coaches, so cutting down on those positions. I think there was a couple specific teams that we were looking at because it was very high cost, but very low enrollment. Off the top of my head, I can't remember which one. I don't know if you do. But I think those were the biggest areas, if you will, in terms of athletics. In terms of clubs, South has 125 clubs, because anybody with a friend and an advisor can have a club. That does not mean that all of those clubs are actually funded. Most of our teachers do it out of the goodness of their hearts, because we have different types of clubs that are like partially supervised and all of the above. So looking at clubs, Emily, really good question. I just started talking with Chris Hardiman, who is our club kind of director, in terms of what the process is going to look like for next year. Like, how are we we did have to implement like a deadline of applications this year because last year we had like 160 and it was a lot for one person to manage. So we do have a deadline, but we're also looking at then what does that look like for next year? Do we have teachers just submit something in terms of, you know, if this is a club that is getting stipended, like what are the criteria for you to meet so that you get your stipend at the end of the year? But we are in early stages of having those conversations because I agree with you. A lot of our kids, I was actually with the mayor at the I'm Amazing program and Henry as well, who was online on Saturday. And I talked to a young girl who said that the only reason she comes to school is for athletics and for after school clubs, right? So we know how important that is. I don't know how, I'm not going to take that away from that child because that is why she comes to school and she was very clear about that. She also told me she was really good, so we'll find out. We'll find out. But know that we are looking at all of that. But again, the club conversation has just started into what that's going to look like.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Henry. Do you want to say something else?
Yeah, I was just saying, I think for around sports that there are going to be some differences between the two schools just because of the offerings we have. And so, for example, you know, we are looking at some tougher decisions, like our dance program, for example, is 2 seasons. And so that's a question we have to look at. And our joint boys gymnastics program, for example, that, you know, there's about 4 teams in the state right now. We have to look at that kind of participation. So those are really, really hard decisions and we're not there yet, but they are certainly things that we have to consider. Additionally, I would just say that we have a lot of clubs that run with no stipend. And it requires an adult to volunteer their time to say yes. So that's just putting more pressure on our adults to say yes to kids when they ask to be a club advisor. So that's what's going to be, you know, I don't know if we're going to have fewer clubs, but I do know that we're going to get a lot more kids really begging teachers to be club advisors.
Quick follow-up question. I think about programs like Athletes Unlimited. Is that part of this 10% cut or is that separate? All right, good. Perfect.
Athletes Unlimited is a city side program as opposed to a school side program.
Please don't cut it.
And it's staying very intact.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. I think next Kathy and then Paul.
So Emily just asked my question. My question was going to be about how do you actually implement 10%?
Thank you, Kathy. Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you, Tamika. It was a very clear presentation. Thank you very, very much. I have a question for Kathy, but first I just want to thank you for trying to preserve the music programs. And want to offer the hypothesis that not only for you, but around the country, perhaps one reason choral enrollment has dropped was that for 2 years, they couldn't sing. And so we might have lost a cadre of people. And as a former choral singer, I hope they come back. Kathy, the question for you is this, and it really arises from Anfeng and Emily's reactions to the presentation. When you were putting the budget together, what in your mind and those of Toby and Aisha and everybody, what was the target allocation of the reductions among the high school, the middle schools, and the elementary schools? Is it based on some per student per capita reduction, or was there something else that drove this set of decisions?
I'm going to answer it the best I can. I see Liam poking his head. So one of the things that we had talked about, and I'm trying to remember the presentation. I want to say it might have been February, early March. We looked at every single department. What is their percentage of the budget? So secondary included both middle and high school. I don't believe we divided it. We gave Toby a number, as we did Aisha, as we did teaching and learning, student support services. And quite honestly, Paul, when we did that kind of a presentation early on, and we were careful, student support services, as you can imagine, is a large part of the budget, both for general education, special education. And I know there were concerns right away. Rajiv had said to me, how do you expect? It was well over a $2 million, I think, reduction at that point. And based on the very things that we're sitting here talking about now. So we were able to, through the process, you'll hear the presentation Thursday evening with student support services. That's not where we landed, but there was impact on other budgets because of that. So Liam could probably explain it a little bit better, but it really was, teaching and learning, not a large budget overall as a percentage of our entire budget. So they had a smaller allocation that was their really target to get to. So it was a process we started probably sometime in January, kept refining it, meeting with directors, department heads. It doesn't work to try to stay away from the classroom, because we sit here and we talk about 89% of the budget is our staffing, our personnel, hence the large impact when it comes down to, programs that you might eliminate, or as we said, across the board reductions. You'll hear some of that when we talk about some of the other departments.
So if I can play this back, just to make sure, it sounds like the starting point was proportional to existing expense, but then you look at special ed and you say, well, you can't really cut that for statutory and other reasons. And so then that would get reallocated to the other functions. Is it kind of something like that from the top down? And then there's a bottom-up approach also.
It is. We were very careful for compliance. I mean, right away, we understood that we are required legally to provide, the services, that our students need. And we were kind of pushing the line with even some of the caseloads, or even making a decision. You'll hear when I did the presentation the other day, we had talked about halting the need to go to Bowen and expand the STRIDE program.
Right.
And we took a step back and said, this is not going to benefit the district. In other words, we'll be looking at putting more students possibly in another placement versus providing and doing the good job that we've been doing about developing our own programs, which are costly at first, but provide so many benefits for the student and for the district.
Toby, you wanted to?
Can I add one thing to that, Kathy? There's a couple of different ways to slice it as we look at the proportional amounts for different departments. So we can look at it by the department. And as you see here, the secondary budget doesn't cover everything at middle and high school, or look at it by location and then by other factors as well, personnel versus expenses, various things like that. So we tried to look at it as many different ways as possible we had proportional targets for all of those areas, but we didn't hit them spot on in every case. Because the last part of the process was all of us sitting down and working together to collaborate on, look, where the last pieces of this going to come from? And if we're a little over, what could we put back? And so there's, I wouldn't call it horse trading, because we were working very collaboratively as educators to figure out what made the most sense for students and being able to continue to offer the highest quality education.
Thanks. The reason I was asking, I just want parents watching to have a clear understanding that we weren't trying to grab more out of one part of the school system than another part, that you were trying, subject to everything Toby just said, into the special ed needs and so on, trying to spread this across as equitably as possible. And as Toby was just saying, it's not always possible to do that to the nth degree because of geography and all the rest. And so just wanted to get
And you
that
heard enrollment play into this
Of course.
clearly with
Oh,
the middle
yeah,
school
clearly.
right now. You have a larger than not 8th grade class moving up to high school. They had taken cuts last year. We had to address that right away.
Sure.
You know, before we could even proportionally take those cuts, we had to add. We added to the high school and knew that we had the decreases at the middle school level.
That's really helpful. I also just want to apologize in advance. I won't be here Thursday because it's Passover Seder night, but I may give questions to other people to ask on my behalf. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Go ahead, Cove.
I have a quick one, but, you know, I definitely feel for the middle schools. I mean, I see that there's obviously an enrollment drop, but I know, you know, I have a couple concerns. I mean, obviously those students are high need and, you know, I think middle schools, you know, often a tough time anyway. I think that, you know, we talked about at the elementary school, if we do have an increase, we have these flex teachers, a lot harder to add, obviously, a flex teacher at the middle school because you have these existing teams. So you're not going to have a way to adjust that. And second, like I have taught on 2-person teams and I love them. I think that it's more important though to be intentional about where those 2-person teams sit. I've, you know, seen models where they sit at the younger grades or they move through, and then it's a purposeful model to have a 2-person versus a 4-person team. Just asking different people to do it, you know, is a lot harder. So, you know, I guess I feel more comfortable if you said we're going to have a 2-person team and it's going to loop, or it's going to be 2 people at the 6th grade and then the 4-people team. I mean, I do think fundamentally as a middle school educator, it's harder to have those 2-people teams at the 8th grade when the math and the science get a bit more complex. So I don't know. I hope that, you know, I realize it obviously seems like an obvious place we need to do something because of the enrollment drop, but I still have concerns, and I hope we can somehow make sense of it and make it a model and not just a necessity. So hopefully we can restore some. Who knows?
Thanks, Cove. Go ahead, Rajiv, one more.
Something really quick, actually jogged by the question Emily had about Athletes Unlimited. I'm assuming the 10% reduction will also apply to the unified teams at both North and South, right? They're not exempt from that, wonderful as they are.
Yeah, so they're part of the athletic budget, so they would be part of that. And again, as we look to distribute the cuts across teams, you know, if there are areas to reduce, we can. If there are places that there's not a reduction to take based on the terrific participation, I know at middle and high school in the unified teams, that may not be an area that ends up having a reduction, because again, we're not just taking 10% off of the stipends that are contractually rates that are contractually set.
Thanks, Rajiv. Any final thoughts, additional questions? Good. Okay, so Kim, I think you hit the nail on the head about the growing pains with the half teams. As a current half team parent, I will share that kids just think they're losing out on something, but they quickly realize that the experience is just as rich as their 4-team peers or four-person team peers. So I appreciate that. And Cove, I appreciated the context you put on it as well. I think making it intentional, it seems like a good thing for us to focus on. I want to pick up a thread that I heard, I think it was Jackie who mentioned. She talked about losing really talented people. And you said people who reflect the diversity of our students. So if we're kind of exploring that further, some of the reductions will impact staff that have been added over the last couple of years as we've been more intentional about diversifying our workforce. And so I guess it would just be good to have an update on what those numbers are. I think if it's a direction that we have to go because we have this budget shortfall, and that those cuts or those reductions are we can't help them. I think it's important to know where what the new landscape will look like, where we'll have to build back up over the years, and how long it may take to get back to the level that we'd already kind of invested in getting to. So that's just a thought that I wanted to. I heard it and it kind of rung a little bit in my ears. But I appreciate that. So thank you, all of you. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Toby. Appreciate that. Appreciate a really good presentation through the budget here.
Thank you, everyone.
So, as promised, we can certainly take up ideas. I think, Chris, you started laying some out of what you would like to see in terms of us exploring ways of increasing our overall, the top number of our budget. And I thank you for waiting until now to really go into those details. Like I said, it was probably the most respectful way to utilize these folks in their time, but also it allows us to hear everything in detail and then consider it. And I don't think, if I could go one further, maybe have us be able to talk as a committee together today. You put out your ideas, we'll think about them, come back at one of our later meetings, perhaps on the 10th or the 12th. We can have opportunities at each of those meetings to talk about it more and talk about other things as we kind of grapple with what package we're going to pass and how we're going to do that. So with that, I think, go ahead. Floor is yours.
Sure. Thanks, Tamika. And after listening to the presentations this evening, there's certainly nothing that's dissuaded the view I'm about to present to you, and I think has only emboldened it. So, I mean, I get it. We're under any circumstance, we're going to have to make cuts, and you know, some of those cuts are going to be cuts we don't want to have to make. But I do think we need to consider all options before we capitulate on the budget priorities we put out last December. And specifically, I'm thinking of class size which was probably the just most in-your-face impactful thing we heard tonight across the board, but programming, social, emotional, and mental health as well. I think we still owe this to our kids. So, as I said, my proposal, and I would prefer to move on this evening, and I'll explain why in a little bit. My proposal is that we reduce the line items of our 3.75% OPEB contribution, the Medicare Part B premiums that we reimburse, and the new renewable energy credits for which we write a check to the city. I think reductions in these items may be sufficient to provide our kids what they need, and this may be the only way we can get there. So to speak about each of them, 3.75% OPEB contribution. So every pay cycle, NPS transfers an amount to the city equal to 3.75% of the salaries and wages paid in that cycle. It's consistent with city practice, and it's automated into the payroll system. The amount budgeted for this year is $3.187 million. I want to be clear, this is a payment to a trust that invests the funds to meet the city's liability with respect to future retiree benefits. Reducing this contribution in the current year will not impact any current or future retirees' benefits. It's a shifting of the burden from current taxpayers to future taxpayers, but there is no contractual obligation that this funding occurs. Now, I do think this funding is fiscally prudent. The liability is being born of services that are being provided today, and the burden should be incurred today. That said, I don't think we can say we've done everything we need to do for our students if we prioritize that payment over 28 kids in an elementary classroom. It's responsible for all of us to go and fund our IRAs and our 401ks, but we're not going to do that, make that annual payment when we can't afford to put food on the table for the kids. I also wouldn't propose this if there were no possible fix in sight, if this was just a perpetual black hole we were looking into, just as we avoid using one-time funds for ongoing expenses. But a lot can change over the next couple of years, and I see this particular reduction as a bridge for a year or two to get us to potential sustainability in our budget. There's levers the city is investigating that may provide benefits. We have a new superintendent starting in a few months. 4 of the 8 of us elected school committee members weren't here 14 months ago. So there's changes happening, and there's a whole host of outcomes that may prove positive for our fiscal situation over the next couple of years. And I think there's value in preserving what we have in the system now, because these proposed cuts are going to be massively disruptive. It's about preserving the option that we can right this ship. And I wouldn't want to see us make these cuts and then have to backtrack, similar to what you were just talking about, Tamika, in our hiring efforts, and what would it take to claw those back over the coming years? I don't want to have to see us go through that cycle if we don't have to. It should be our absolute last resort. And on that last point of thinking about this as a bridge to the next couple of years, and I made this point last year when we were talking about one-time funds and ARPA funds, kids may be in a better place in a couple of years, better able to withstand that larger classroom, that lesser level of support. And I think that is an option worth playing out as well. So to address the Medicare Part B reimbursement. So every year we reimburse current retirees for their Medicare Part B premiums paid up to $925 per year per covered person. Like OPEB, I think it's consistent with city practice, and the amount budgeted for this year is $1.36 million. This has been an absolutely generous benefit we've been able to provide to our retirees, but we simply can't afford it anymore. We can't afford it when it means we have to increase our middle school team sizes to a level we don't want to see. We are, like the OPEB contribution, not contractually obligated to make the reimbursement. And so I think as we think about cuts across the system, I believe this has to be included. And I want to point out that I'm deliberately proposing that we allow Kathy and her team to reduce these line items, not absolutely zero them out. Because with something like this, I know there's been talk in the past of phasing out reimbursements or retaining for certain age levels. And that flexibility can remain with a concept of saying, let's allow Kathy and the team to reduce expenses to a level that restores our most critical services. But I think this is something we just can no longer afford to do. And this would, unlike that bridge with OPEB, represent a structural shift, a permanent structural shift in our budget. And then finally, with the renewable energy credits, I know this is something I've talked about before. It's not a huge number. This is $60,000 compared to the other two. But again, it is not a contractual obligation of MPS. And look, this isn't a statement about the city's energy or climate policy or anything like that. I see this as this is a city and a community goal, and it's not something that directly benefits students. So I think it's a burden that should be borne by the city and the community and not borne by students in seeing further staff reductions so we can afford this payment. So I think all of these things, can hopefully allow us to look our constituents or students in the eye and say, we're able to give them what they need. We'll still be making reductions. We'll still be losing programs and some people that we want to retain. There's no avoiding that. But hopefully we can avoid the worst outcomes. And this is why I think this may make sense to bring this forward now as opposed to waiting, Tamika. This is the start of the budget discussion. And whatever we decide today, amounts, giving Kathy and her team the ability to reduce these amounts and reallocate those funds, those can always be added back. This is just a different starting point in the process. So we can sit here and bang our heads against the wall for the next 2 or 3 weeks, figuring out how we restore dozens of teachers' jobs, or we can sit here and bang our heads against the wall, thinking about how we restore OPEB funding. I can tell you which of those conversations I'd rather have over the next couple weeks. So finally, I just want to say, look, I know this was not your preferred option, and I apologize. This is somewhat disruptive to the agenda, and that, you know, for most of you, by definition, this is the first time you're hearing of my ideas here, but that's open meeting law, and I can't help it. I also recognize that some folks in city may not be thrilled with this proposal, but I ask that the line item authority of this committee be respected. Finally, I just noticed, look, this is ripe for discussion. This is a absolutely direct impact of the discussion here tonight in terms of budget line items pertaining to elementary and secondary. And you know, I think this makes sense to address this evening. So I am prepared to bring forth a motion.
So I think, yes, Mayor Fuller, I'll turn to you in a minute, but always, I think it's always appropriate for us to have conversations as a committee rather than wish you'd had the conversation. So making space for us to hear your idea and to consider it in the way that we can actually do that is fine. I think all of us would have said, sure, let's have that conversation. The tricky part was about starting the meeting there, because that was essentially taking away the ability of the staff to do what it is they've been preparing for weeks to do. And so it wasn't, let's not have this, let's wait. And so having done that, I appreciate you waiting and putting that forward today.
If
I think
address that point very quickly.
Sure.
Certainly my intention in bringing this forth at the beginning of the meeting was actually out of respect for the staff. And we may have saw that different ways, and there's no easy way to go about, you know, putting forth something like this. But I saw it as, you know, if this is something this committee is going to agree to, then let's have that out there up front. As I said, this is a reframing where we start the process. Do we start it thinking about we've got a shortfall and we've got to cut teachers, or do we start it thinking about we've got a shortfall and we've got to temporarily suspend our OPEB funding, or think about reducing that generous benefit because we can just no longer afford it? So that was why I wanted to have that at the beginning of the meeting.
Yep. And while
certainly not out of disrespect to our staff.
Understood. While I think it's important for us to have that conversation, I'm still going to ask you to hold off making the motion. And just logistically, I think it's something that we need to consider from multiple angles and to consider the ramifications, unintended though they may be, and to really just have that thoughtful conversation. This might be our first impression, if you will. And typically we take up measures on first impression, we consider them, we have discussions, then we vote. So even under that thinking, that would be the appropriate protocol. Not the only one, but I would argue the appropriate one. And with that, I'll turn to Mayor Fuller. You can have the floor.
I didn't know if Rajiv had his hand up if he wanted to speak first.
Absolutely.
Sure, of course.
And this will be brief. we're back to unfortunately where we were last year, possibly in an even more difficult position in terms of the budget. And I have spoken briefly with Chris about his proposals. And I think what they give us is something important, which is potential flexibility. We cannot zero out these items necessarily. The OPEB one certainly is a commitment. It's something that could be reduced, but at some point will have to be paid. However, the question is, does that point have to be this year or next year? Or can it be stretched out in order to make sure that we are not losing ground in terms of the progress we've made with supporting our students? The Medicare Part B reimbursement, I think, falls very much into it's great we can do this and have been doing it. It just may not be sustainable in this budget environment. So I feel like these are all, and the energy credits are a valid point to bring up. They're not going to move the needle very much, not like the other two. Excuse me, but I do think that the flexibility is important considering those. And I feel like also these go to the top line, right? We're not talking about doing one of these and offsetting something very specific that Toby and team or Aisha and team brought forward today, or that Casey and Liam will be bringing up in subsequent discussions. We almost certainly, if we move forward with trying to add to the top line, we'll have discussions with Kathy and her team about where anything that we could bring back to the budget could be applied. So my thinking here is we're not going to turn these things off completely, but it's certainly going to be helpful if we can consider a flexibility that is going to bring back or lead to us not having as significant an impact as we've started hearing about.
Thanks, Ricky. Mayor Fuller.
Anybody else? I was guessing.
Go ahead, Paul.
You're guessing what? That's the question. I'm particularly glad that Chris has mentioned the Medicare stipend. As someone, by the way, who would be the potential beneficiary of it on January 1st, there's no statutory reason to provide that stipend. There's no collective bargaining contractual reason to provide that stipend. And I would say there's basically no equitable reason to provide it, certainly on a going forward basis to any new retiree. So at a minimum, should we get into this in greater detail, I would say going forward, just stop it. But I would go further. I would go back a ways also, and look at the numbers. Look at the people who are getting this stipend. Look at what their level of pension benefits is, depending when they retired, and have some kind of sliding scale, and perhaps phase in or phase out period that we could implement. Doing that, and there's a slight contrast with the OPEB one, which I'll get back to in a second. Doing that has no impact on city finances, other than saving money for us. And if the mayor and her people decide to do it for other city employees potentially there. So it's a direct benefit to the school system at no cost to any taxpayers. And so I think that one is a category that's really worth looking at. On OPEB, I'm very sympathetic to the way Chris has constructed the argument there, which is that when you're funding a future obligation like that, there's a whole different set of patterns that you can use to fund it. And it's not unreasonable to look at your current needs as well as those future obligations to decide what you need to do at any given time along that pathway. I don't have a specific pattern in mind, but I do think it's worth looking into to see if the kind of pause that Chris seems to be suggesting is fiscally prudent in the long run. Maybe slowing things down now and making them up in the future, depending on future events and so on. And so worth looking into for sure. And as both people have mentioned, the renewable energy credits is relatively small, and I don't really have an opinion on that. But certainly on the first item, I actually feel pretty strongly about it, that we don't have an obligation of any great significance for current, future retirees or recent retirees. Looking further back, perhaps we do have some kind of moral obligation. So I think both things are worth looking at. Thanks, Ruth Ann.
Emily, I see one more taker.
One more taker, yeah. Yeah, I'll be short, I promise, be short. I have to say, I'm kind of intrigued with the concept, particularly in light of the presentations that we just got. And I know I've used the term grim about 50 times, but I'll say it again, grim. I think for me, in terms of the Medicare stuff, I actually agree with Paul that if we are going to do anything in that vein, that it has to be, it can't be wholesale. We have to look, there are people who have fixed incomes, who have retired a while ago, who this would be very detrimental to them if they didn't get the benefit. So I just want to put that out there. I think that why you talked about a moral obligation, and I totally agree with that. In terms of the other stuff and the OPEB stuff, for me personally, I'd like to get more information. I can't say, yes, I'm totally for this. The concept and the idea, like I said, is intriguing, but I would like to understand more what the consequences would be, what this actually means at the end of the day. So that's where I'm at.
I'll be real brief.
Can't help ourselves.
I borrow the word intrigued. I did not talk to Chris at all and just learn now. I think probably worth looking, reviewing, but also I agree with Tamika that we need to get information, review, consider, and I would like Chris to write something or someone to write something, because this is beyond the normal definition of school budget now. We're talking about something more. So I'm dying to hear our mayor's perspective, and then we'll consider.
Don't die over it. I promise you. Don't.
Okay, I'm done. So I hope we're not talking any more about specific things, but Mayor, please.
Anyone else? Okay. First of all, it's important to raise these important questions and to talk about them. So I'm happy to have this discussion. Often when Kathy has been Superintendent Smith has been raising this page, what she often adds on to it, I actually wrote it as she was speaking earlier tonight, sustainable budget. So one of the important things that we are trying to do is create a sustainable budget for the city and for the Newton Public Schools for today and tomorrow and for the future. Sustainable means a lot of different things. One of them, for example, I remember a year ago when we were discussing the school budget, we're talking, do you cut maintenance now because you know it'll cost more later? So you think about what changes you make now and the impact in the future. That's one version of sustainability. I have been closely attuned and extremely sensitive to the fact that the Newton Public Schools do not have a sustainable budget. I've known this for a number of years. And that is why I personally came forward as a leader to our residents, and in a most difficult economic and I would say psychological period, a period of tension and anxiety, asked our residents to increase their taxes. It was directly because of that, the presentations that Aisha and Toby made tonight reinforced and lifted up the reasons why we needed more funding and to have a sustainable budget. I share the deep concerns of the two of them and the principals who sat with them tonight and the teachers that they represent and the educators. This body, with the exception of me, the 8 school committee members, are elected to focus specifically on the schools. That is an honorable and important role. As mayor, there is a reason why I sit on the school committee, and I would like to say in my 6 years, I think I've missed less than a handful of meetings. This is a sacred duty that we have to educate our young people. The mission of the Newton Public Schools for Equity and Excellence, we reaffirmed just a week ago. Both matter, and as we all understand, schools are driven by people. So that not having the $4.5 million understandably is making all of us very uncomfortable. We are one community, though. We are not the schools separate from our police department and our fire department and our health department and our DPW department and our public buildings department. We are one community. Yes, the Newton Public Schools are our largest department, as it is fitting and right. We work together. I will remind you that I have not delivered the city budget yet. And I'm serious by saying I will walk through how I think about Medicare Part B and retiree health care, otherwise known as OPEB, and sustainability. If this honorable body chooses to reduce their contribution to our community, our retirees, your retirees, and our joint commitment to environmental sustainability, I do have the choice of reducing the allocation by just that same amount. Please know that is in the role of a mayor. I care about our retirees. Your school teachers, your aides, your custodians are mine. They are mine. We make a promise to our current employees about the benefits that they will receive. And it is also our sacred duty to honor that commitment. Let's start with retiree health care, which is otherwise known as other post-employment benefits. There's a little bit of life insurance in there, but the most part of it is retiree health care. School committee member Bresky very forcefully said, those who are providing the services today, it is today's taxpayers who are supposed to be paying for those services in the future. we should be paying 8% of on top of every individual's wages into this trust fund. That is our responsibility today. When I came in as mayor, we were way below that. And I am slowly working our way up to the 8%. Next year, I'm doing a half of a basis point, 0.05% increase to 3.75%. We're way below where we should be, but I'm working it. We're working it. We're slowly graduating our way up. And you know what? Normally I would have gone up by more, but in light of the challenges we're facing, I made it a smaller increase. School committee member Breschke understands that we have a close collaborative relationship with our pension retirement board. While they are focused on pension, and that's where their authority lies, in fact, they care deeply about their retirees and not just their pensions, but their retiree health care. And they will be making decisions in the coming days about perhaps helping the city and the schools out by extending the funding schedule. I sure hope what you brought up tonight doesn't jeopardize a much more important funding decision. I fear that it does. There are no secrets. This is a televised hearing. Every member of that retirement board, which has independent authority, heard your words tonight, School Committee Breschke. By slowly funding this OPEB trust fund, you know when we'll pay it, we'll actually be fully funded? This is a 30-year plan. I started on this when I was an alderman, not even a city councilor. We're targeted for the 2040s, mid-2040s. Let's talk about Medicare Part B. The wonderful part about having a collaborative relationship with the Newton Public Schools, with Superintendent Smith, with Assistant Superintendent Hurley, is that we work closely together. Together, we have been looking at possible ways forward with health insurance, and Liam Hurley is right in the mix with us as we think carefully about the implications for that for Medicare Part B. We may have a way forward, and it does matter what the size of someone's pension is, how old they are, what other sources of income they have. These are our people. These aren't nameless, faceless. Superintendent Smith started tonight by talking about Ernie Seaholes, who died in March. That's the person who, until March, was receiving this help. That's us. If we are so lucky to have people stay here, have their career here, you bet I take that really seriously. I am looking at it. Maureen Lemieux's looking at it. Michelle Pizzey O'Brien is looking at. Liam Hurley's going to be right in the mix of this. We may have a way forward with Medicare Part B that keeps people whole as we adjust health insurance. I'm not unaware of the challenges that our students are facing right now. And for next year, I'm doing everything I can, including looking at Medicare Part B. Stick with us. We're on a path. We will uphold our values in taking care of our current children and the teachers who used to teach, the ones who were here before. If any of you are saying sustainability is not a core value of the Newton Public Schools, please raise your hand. Our students will lead the way on this if you aren't able to do that from this side of the table. If anything, we're way behind on our renewable energy credits. We're only doing 10% of our electricity through the form of renewables. We need to be higher, not lower. And in these times of crisis, that's when your values count. It's not in the easy times that your values count. It's right now in these challenging times. You better believe I believe in the Recs, and I sure hope this school committee does as well. If anything, we need to move them up in the years ahead. And I will tell you, that is a contract. Our contract for the Recs, which we have all committed to jointly, goes into fiscal year 2025, November, I think, something at 2024, FY 2025. We are trying to set up our future soup. And by the way, you pull back on things like retiree health care and supporting your retirees. Don't kid yourself, it boomerangs in a future year. That's what happened with charter maintenance this year. We pulled it back 400 last year. Guess what? Poor Liam Hurley and his team were saying, oh, we can't sustain that more than 1 year. Let's set up Superintendent Nolan for a sustainable budget in all senses of the words. You cut this year, you're going to have to, it's going to hurt our children more next year. You know, I believe in these schools. I regret as deeply as anyone else that the override didn't pass. We've got to face up to this and take care of our current employees, our past employees, and the future of our children, which is all about sustainability in the environment. Thank you. Can you tell I feel pretty strongly about this?
Thank you, Mayor Fuller. I think, again, I'm going to ask that you hold off making a motion. I do believe that would be premature. What I heard from several members is that while you have spent a great deal of time considering the proposals you put before our committee, that isn't a reciprocal type of understanding from these members. So prior to being able to responsibly and knowledgeably make a decision on the items that you put before us, the 3 items here, I think that the members should be afforded some time to consider what are the ramifications, should be able to avail ourselves of our staff who might have some opinion as to whether those are things that they would move forward on, or whether they would hold back or find some other pathway towards doing what you suggest over time. I don't know, and we don't have that information for us to consider. So again, it's premature. Another thing I heard from our mayor, who is the source of where we as a school district get our allocation, is that there would be, whether consequences are intended or unintended, there would have to be some type of trade-off. If we increase our funding in this mechanism, there is a risk that another line of funding would decrease to offset what we've done. That's what I heard. That's what all of you have heard. I know that the mayor has committed to or offered to assist the Newton Public Schools, absorb our out-of-district 1.4 million, is it? That's a substantial cost. I know that there are legal settlements that we've been, that our mayor has agreed to assist the Newton Public Schools. That's at a significant cost. So when we're talking about the tit for tat, meaning NPS is shouldering burdens that are properly housed over on the city side, I would say that's a reciprocal situation from time to time. And I get the urge, the impetus to say, well, we don't want to be facing these cuts. We should be scraping our budget and finding ways to increase our top dollar amount so that we don't have to make our 56.4 FTE reduction. I got that wrong. I know I did. I get that urge, but I think this is a little bit of an aggressive way of doing it, not the putting it on the table, but if we're going to say, we're going to put this on the table and I want a motion now today, that seems to me that it's not a collaborative approach. It doesn't give the members enough time to consider the ramifications. And so I'm asking you to hold off on doing something. That's all I can do.
Okay, irrespective of a motion or not, I believe there's a couple of points of the mayor's I'd like to respond to.
I would also like us to hold on.
I think the point is that, I mean,
You know what, otherwise we're gonna go back and
Hold on.
forth.
Everyone, hold on. Everyone has had one opportunity to speak, save for Kathy Shields and Cove Davis. Everyone else has had one strike at the bat. I'm messing up that sports analogy. You know, I don't do that. Anyways, I'm asking us to take the temperature down. And
I
we'll
did not
come,
raise the temperature.
I
raised it intentionally.
So
Understood.
I'm asking us to just take the beat, this meeting, come back at it, our next meeting, and keep talking as we can as a committee. Chris, you put down 3 separate proposals for us to consider. I would love, I think Anping made the suggestion, write it down, send a memo through Lisa. Lisa will send it to us. Point to the specific parts of our budget that you would like us to look at with your specific recommendations in mind. We will pick them up and talk about it during our next, at the end of the presentation from our staff of our next meeting.
There were very distinct points that I believe.
Put them in your memo.
I move that the committee allow me the chance to respond.
All right, Chris has moved. Is there a second on Chris's motion? There's a second. The motion is made for Chris to be able to respond. And there's been a second. Any discussion on that? All right, Ward 1,
Yes.
Ward 2,
Yes.
Ward 3. Microphone towards you, Anping.
Yes.
Ward 4. Fine, yes. Ward 6. Oh, I'm sorry, 5. What did I, sorry.
Yes.
Ward 6.
Yes.
Ward 7. Sure. Ward 8.
Yes.
And Mayor Fuller.
Yes, and I would like to make a motion that I may respond afterwards. Yeah, exactly. Not what I need to do.
All right.
Sorry.
Second that motion, anyone?
Second.
Thank you, Anping. Motion's been made, motion's been seconded for Mayor Fuller to have the, what I will ask is the final words for tonight, save another motion to motion. All right, Ward 1,
Yes.
Ward 2,
Haven't even said anything yet, but sure, why not?
Ward 3,
Yes.
Ward 4, yes, Ward 5,
Sure.
Ward 6,
Yes.
Ward 7,
Yes.
Ward 8,
Yes.
and Mayor Fuller.
Yes.
All right, Chris, go ahead.
Thank you. Look, I think what I brought forth here tonight was a good faith effort to try and help what is a pretty severe situation. We sat here, we listened to cuts, people lament them, they call them sober and dire and all sorts of words. And someone brings forth a good faith effort. And I don't understand why that's an issue. I would like to address a couple things. I don't appreciate the inferences that somehow I or this committee wouldn't care about our retirees. In fact, what I've proposed would have no impact on any retiree. It is a shifting of the burden from current taxpayers to future taxpayers. Current taxpayers are currently carrying the burden of taxpayers of the past who did not fund some of these liabilities. And it is simply a question of the utility of those dollars today versus the utility of investing those dollars in a trust to earn a presumed rate of return to meet those liabilities decades in the future. This is not about retirees. This is about taxpayers. Secondly, and to be clear, that is no different than exactly what I said to the Newton Retirement Board. That this is about a shifting of burden between taxpayers. It is not about retirees. No retiree, no pensioner is affected by this in any way. I made that point clearly. I want to make it here again. Secondly, to the extent the mayor would like to reduce the NPS budget allocation by a proportionate amount of what we may reduce in our line item authority, number one, is making an absolute stark choice between educators' jobs and funding an OPEB trust. Number two, it is indirectly usurping our line item authority by making that threat. I want that distinct choice to be clear. Benefits received by retirees are well bargained for. I think our negotiating team can probably attest to that. We are not stepping on any obligation here. Absolutely not. If anything, I would say the more questionable choice is on the Medicare Part B front, because that would have an impact to current retirees. Again, I'm suggesting that Kathy Smith and team have the flexibility so that we can manage our way through that. But the mayor herself has suggested something they're thinking about. So I don't think there's any moral outrage to be had on behalf of the city to me or this committee when it's apparently under discussion, was never brought to my attention, however. So to talk about these retirees and say, you know, these are not nameless, faceless people, that was never, ever implied. Our children aren't nameless, faceless people either. Finally, on environmental sustainability, again, this becomes a question of utility. We could go out and buy a fleet of electric buses tomorrow if we wanted. Why don't we do that? If we are so committed to environmental responsibility. Because we can't afford to. That's why. There's costs and benefits. There's trade-offs to everything. This is simply about, have we hit the point of pain where you could say, you know what? There might be that sustainability a couple years ahead of us. How do we get there? And until I hear some other potential solutions put forth, I would hold the moral outrage. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Mayor Fuller.
I will take you at your word that you were trying to make a good faith effort to help. It certainly wasn't one that you ever chatted with me about and brainstormed about in the months and months and months that we've served together on the school committee. But I'll take you at your word, and I mean that. You better believe that the decisions we make today about funding the benefits for our retirees affect the people who are retired today. Don't kid yourself that that's some nameless person. The person who retired last year is counting on us to fund their pension to the end of their days and for their spouse as well. This is about retirees. You said it again, shifting the responsibilities of current taxpayers to future ones is inconsistent with what I know you actually believe. We have talked about that over time. I do have the right to make a proposal on the allocation to the Newton Public Schools. And we have done that with a full understanding that NPS contributes towards their retiree health care, towards the Medicare Part B of their retirees, and to the sustainability efforts of this community. If you want to change the game at the last minute, I'll also change the game at the last minute. It is our responsibility in this difficult time to face this challenge head on. You've seen people like Aisha Farag and Toby Romer and all their principals face it head on. Now it's our turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Fuller. So my request, I think, stands. The request is for you to capture your proposal, write it down. We can talk about it again when we have more detail, when the members have had more opportunity to think about what you put on the table and for us to consider it as a committee. We can take it up during any one of our next couple of meetings on April 10th. At the end of that, after the IT library presentation and the school enrollment update, or after a very lengthy, most likely public hearing on April 12th. Those are the two most prescient opportunities for us to pick this topic up. I don't think it's appropriate for us to move on it today. There are too many unknowns, and we haven't heard from our staff. We haven't even heard from our interim superintendent as to, and I'm not going to put her on the spot right here, right now. That would not be fair. I think there are some blanks that we need to fill in, and then we should absolutely take up this issue and think about it and consider it.
Out of respect for my fellow members and to ensure that we all have as much information as possible to make this decision, I will defer making a motion till a future meeting.
Appreciate that. And I think the request, if I'm going to push a little further, was for you to put together a memo detailing what you would like this committee to do and why. Share it with Lisa. Lisa will share it with us. We will talk about it and discuss it during one of those next two opportunities to meet.
I will submit something to Tamika for
Lisa.
You're Tamika.
Yes.
I will submit something to Lisa for perhaps next week.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. So I appreciate that. And Chris, I think we all appreciate your zeal with trying to solve this problem that we are all of us obligated to solve. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Thank you. With that, we have concluded the posted business for tonight's meeting. Our next meeting will be on April 6th with another special school committee meeting where we will discuss teaching and learning and student services. Again, there will be no public comment during that meeting, but we have the budget hearing the public hearing on the budget, that is on April 12th. And thank you to our central staff who are here tonight. Thank you to our principals who attended. Thank you to our student rep, Max, for coming and having a really good question. We appreciate all of that. Our meeting is now adjourned. Good night, everyone.
Recording